The stagecoach wheel cracked against stone, and Graceland Hudson's world shattered with it. Mud, blood, a stranger's hand gripping hers in the darkness. She didn't know his name yet, Ryan Fitzpatrick, but in 48 hours he would save her life twice, steal her land, and ask her to marry him. Not necessarily in that order. This is a story about survival, deception, and the kind of love that grows in the space between desperation and hope. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this journey travels. Hit that like button, and let me take you back to a storm-soaked road in 1876 where everything began with a broken wheel and a lie. The morning Graceland Hudson left Millbrook, the sky hung low and gray like a burial shroud. She stood outside the general store with her small leather satchel clutched against her chest, counting coins in her palm for the third time. $17.40. It was all she had left in the world. "Final call for Cedar Springs," the stagecoach driver shouted, his voice cutting through the pre-dawn chill. Graceland's fingers trembled as she closed them around the money. $17 would get her to Cedar Springs and back, barely. There would be nothing left for food, nothing for lodging if she needed to stay, nothing for the medicine her mother might need. But her mother was dying, and some choices made themselves. She approached the coach, a weather-beaten monstrosity that had seen better decades. The driver, a grizzled man with tobacco-stained teeth, barely glanced at her as she handed over the fare. $12, he grunted. "The sign said 10, Graceland said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Sign's old, price went up." He spat a stream of brown liquid into the dirt. "Roads are bad this time of year. You want to get to Cedar Springs or not?" She wanted to argue. Every dollar mattered, but she could see in his eyes that he knew she had no choice, and men like him always exploited that knowledge. She counted out $12 and climbed aboard, her remaining $5.40 feeling impossibly small in her pocket. The interior smelled of old leather, sweat, and something else, something sweet and cloying that made her stomach turn. 3 other passengers were already seated. An elderly woman with a face like carved oak sat by the window, her hands folded over a worn Bible. Across from her, a portly man in a suit too fine for stagecoach travel fanned himself with a newspaper despite the morning cold. And in the corner, partially shadowed, sat a man who looked up as Graceland entered. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. His were gray, not the dull gray of rain clouds, but something clearer, like river stones. He wore dark trousers and a simple shirt, no jacket despite the cold. His face was angular, weathered in a way that spoke of hard work rather than hard living. He nodded once, a bare acknowledgement, then returned his attention to the window. Graceland settled into the remaining seat beside the elderly woman, arranging her skirts with hands that wouldn't quite stop shaking. It wasn't the cold making her tremble. It was everything else. The letter she'd received 3 days ago was folded in her satchel, the words burned into her memory. "Your mother is gravely ill. Come quickly if you wish to see her again." "First time to Cedar Springs?" the elderly woman asked, her voice surprisingly gentle. "Yes, ma'am." Graceland forced a small smile. "Visiting family?" "I'm Mrs. Brennan. That's Mr. Whitmore." She indicated the portly man with a subtle gesture. "And that's Mr. Fitzpatrick. He's been quiet as a church mouse since Denver." The man in the corner, Fitzpatrick, didn't react to hearing his name. He simply continued staring out the window as the coach lurched into motion. The first hour passed in uncomfortable silence, broken only by Mr. Whitmore's periodic sighs and the creaking of the coach. Graceland tried to focus on what she would say to her mother, how she would manage the time there, but her thoughts kept scattering. She and her mother hadn't spoken in 2 years, not since the argument after Thomas died. Thomas. Even thinking his name felt like pressing on a bruise that would never quite heal. "We should reach Thornton's Crossing by midday," Mrs. Brennan offered, apparently unable to bear the silence any longer. "They'll have hot food there, if you're hungry." Graceland's stomach was empty, but she shook her head. She couldn't afford hot food. The $5 in her pocket needed to last for however long this journey took. The road deteriorated as morning wore on. What had started as a rough but passable track became a rutted nightmare of mud and standing water. The recent storms had transformed the prairie into a treacherous obstacle course. The coach pitched and rolled like a ship in rough seas. "Dear Lord," Mr. Whitmore muttered as they hit a particularly brutal rut. His newspaper slipped from his fingers, and Graceland watched it slide across the floor toward Fitzpatrick's boots. The quiet man bent and retrieved it, handing it back without a word. "Thank you," Whitmore said, though he sounded more annoyed than grateful. "This is intolerable, absolutely intolerable. I paid good money for this passage." "We all did," Mrs. Brennan said mildly. "Yes, but I paid for first-class accommodation. This is hardly—" The coach lurched violently to the left. Graceland grabbed for the handrail as the entire vehicle seemed to list sideways. Outside, she could hear the driver cursing, the horses screaming in protest. "Whoa! Whoa! Damn you!" The coach ground to a shuddering halt, tilted at an alarming angle. For a moment, no one moved. Then Fitzpatrick was on his feet, moving with surprising grace despite the tilted floor. He pushed open the door, now partially above them rather than beside them, and pulled himself out. "What's happened?" Mrs. Brennan called after him, but he was already gone. Graceland could hear voices outside, tense and arguing. She carefully made her way to the door and looked out. The coach had sunk axle deep into a massive mud pit that stretched across the entire road. The left rear wheel was completely submerged, and as she watched, the vehicle settled another inch deeper. "We'll have to push," the driver was saying, though he didn't sound happy about it. "All of us. Even the ladies." Preposterous. Mr. Whitmore had followed Graceland to the door. "I paid for passage, not manual labor." "You want to sit here until you starve? That's your business," the driver shot back. "But this coach won't move without everyone pushing." Fitzpatrick was already wading into the mud, his boots disappearing into the thick muck. He bent to examine the sunken wheel, his expression unreadable. "We'll need leverage," he said, his voice carrying despite its quietness. "Rocks, branches, anything solid we can wedge under the wheel." "Listen to him," the driver said. "Man knows what he's talking about." Graceland hiked up her skirts and climbed down. The mud was cold and thick, sucking at her boots with each step. She'd worn her best dress, the dark green one that had been her mother's, because she had nothing else suitable. Now she watched it acquire a coating of prairie mud and tried not to calculate what it would cost to replace. Mrs. Brennan descended more carefully, accepting Fitzpatrick's offered hand. Even Mr. Whitmore eventually climbed down, though his complaints continued unabated. They spent the next hour gathering stones and branches, wedging them beneath the sunken wheel while the driver positioned the horses for maximum pulling power. It was brutal work. The mud seemed actively malevolent, releasing its grip on each stone only after a prolonged struggle. Graceland's hands quickly became raw and bleeding. Her dress was ruined. She could feel mud seeping through her stockings, cold and invasive. "Here," Fitzpatrick appeared beside her, a relatively flat stone in his hands. "This one should work." Together they maneuvered it into place. His hands were calloused, Graceland noticed, but steady. When she slipped in the mud, those same hands caught her elbow, keeping her upright. "Thank you," she managed. "Watch your footing," he said. "Mud's deeper than it looks." It was the most he had said since Denver, and his voice matched everything else about him. Quiet, controlled, giving nothing away. "On my count," the driver shouted. 1, 2, 3. They pushed. Graceland threw all her weight against the coach, her boots sliding in the muck, her shoulders screaming in protest. Beside her, she could hear Mrs. Brennan's labored breathing, Mr. Whitmore's theatrical grunts, and Fitzpatrick, silent and steady, his shoulder against the coach frame. The wheel didn't budge. "Again," the driver called. 1, 2, 3. This time, Graceland felt something give. The wheel lifted fractionally, caught on the stones they'd wedged beneath it. The horses strained forward, and with a sucking sound like a giant's kiss, the coach lurched free. The sudden movement sent Graceland stumbling backward. She would have fallen face first into the mud if strong hands hadn't caught her shoulders. "Steady," Fitzpatrick said. She turned to thank him, but he'd already released her and was moving to help Mrs. Brennan. Graceland stood there in the mud, aware that her heart was beating faster than the exertion warranted. They climbed back into the coach in silence, dripping mud onto the floor. Mrs. Brennan produced a handkerchief and dabbed ineffectually at her face. Mr. Whitmore sat with his arms crossed, glowering at nothing. Graceland looked down at her ruined dress and felt something crack inside her chest, not quite breaking, but definitely fracturing. This dress had been her mother's. She'd worn it at Graceland's wedding. Now it was destroyed, and Graceland was traveling to potentially watch her mother die, and she had $5.40 to her name, and Thomas was dead, and everything was falling apart. She turned her face to the window so no one would see the tears. The coach rolled on. The road, if anything, got worse. They passed through Thornton's Crossing without stopping. The driver claimed they couldn't afford to lose daylight, and Graceland's empty stomach cramped with hunger. She had a small piece of bread in her satchel, saved from breakfast, but she couldn't bring herself to eat it in front of the others. It seemed too pathetic somehow. As afternoon faded toward evening, the sky darkened in a way that had nothing to do with the setting sun. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, massive and bruised-looking. "That's not good," Mrs. Brennan murmured. The driver apparently agreed because he urged the horses to a faster pace. But the storm moved faster. Within an hour, the first fat raindrops began to fall. Within 2, the sky had opened up entirely. Rain hammered the coach roof like artillery fire. The temperature dropped precipitously. Wind buffeted them from side to side, and Graceland could hear the horses struggling against it. Lightning split the sky, followed by thunder so loud it seemed to shake the earth. "We should stop," Mr. Whitmore shouted over the noise. "This is madness." But stopping would mean spending the night in the open, and none of them wanted that. The driver pushed on and they lurched through the darkness, trusting to luck and the horses' instincts. That's when Graceland's breath started coming too fast. It began as a tightness in her chest, a feeling of constriction that had nothing to do with her corset. Her heart accelerated, pounding against her ribs like it was trying to escape. The coach suddenly felt too small, the air too thin. She couldn't breathe. She was going to die. Right here, in this stagecoach, she was going to die just like Thomas had died, suddenly and senselessly, and there was nothing she could do about it. Her hands started shaking uncontrollably. Black spots danced at the edges of her vision. "Mrs. Hudson?" Mrs. Brennan's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you quite all right?" Graceland tried to answer but couldn't form words. The panic was a living thing now, consuming her from the inside. She could see Thomas's face the morning he died, laughing, so alive, kissing her goodbye before heading out to mend the fence. She could see the horse returning without him. She could see his body, broken, in the field. "She's having some kind of fit," Mr. Whitmore said, his voice sharp with alarm. Then there were hands on her shoulders, firm but not restraining. She looked up through her panic and met those riverstone eyes. "Look at me," Fitzpatrick said, his voice cut through the chaos in her head. "Just look at me. Nothing else." She tried to focus on his face, but the panic kept pulling her under. "Breathe with me," he continued, his voice maddeningly calm. "In through your nose. Count to 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. She managed a shuddering inhale. "Hold it. 2, 3, 4. Now out through your mouth. 2, 3, 4. The simple act of counting gave her something to hold on to. She breathed with him, following his measured cadence. Slowly, so slowly, the panic began to recede. "Good," he said. "Again. In. 2, 3, 4. They breathed together while the storm raged around them. Mrs. Brennan watched with concern. Mr. Whitmore had pressed himself into the corner as if fear might be contagious. But Fitzpatrick never looked away, never let go of her shoulders, never stopped that calm, steady counting. Finally, Graceland's breathing normalized. The black spots faded. Her hand stopped shaking. She felt exhausted, wrung out, but the panic had passed. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I don't know what—" "Don't apologize," Fitzpatrick said. He released her shoulders and settled back into his seat, but his eyes remained on her face. "It was the storm. Some people are affected that way." It was a kindness, that lie. They both knew it wasn't the storm, but Graceland was grateful for it nonetheless. "Thank you," she managed. He nodded once, then returned his attention to the window, giving her privacy to recover. The storm continued for another hour before finally beginning to ease. By then, full night had fallen, and the driver called out that they would make camp rather than risk traveling in darkness on roads they could no longer see. They stopped in a clearing beside what might charitably be called a creek. The rain had diminished to a steady drizzle. The driver and his assistant, a young man who hadn't spoken a single word the entire journey, began setting up a makeshift camp while the passengers huddled under the limited shelter of the coach's overhang. There would be no fire in this wet, no hot food. They shared what provisions they had. Mrs. Brennan had some dried meat, Mr. Whitmore reluctantly produced a flask of whiskey, and Graceland contributed her piece of bread, which was immediately soaked by the rain. Fitzpatrick ate nothing. When Mrs. Brennan offered him meat, he declined. "Saving my appetite for Cedar Springs," he said. But Graceland noticed he watched her eat the dried meat with an intensity that suggested his own hunger. As the night deepened, the temperature continued to drop. They couldn't all fit inside the coach to sleep, so the men agreed to take turns keeping watch outside. Fitzpatrick volunteered for first watch. Graceland tried to sleep, wedged between Mrs. Brennan and the coach wall, but exhaustion and actual rest remained frustratingly separate. Her mind kept replaying the panic attack, Fitzpatrick's hands on her shoulders, his calm voice cutting through her terror. She must have eventually dozed because when she opened her eyes again, gray pre-dawn light was filtering through the windows. Her neck ached from the awkward angle. Mrs. Brennan was snoring softly. And there, visible through the window, was Fitzpatrick. He sat on a fallen log about 20 feet from the coach, his back straight despite what must have been a night without sleep. He was staring at something in his hands, a small object she couldn't quite make out. As she watched, he closed his fingers around it and stood, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders. When he turned back toward the coach, their eyes met through the window. Neither looked away. For a long moment, they simply regarded each other across the distance, a widow with $5 to her name and a stranger who had kept her from drowning in her own mind. Then he nodded, the same small acknowledgement he'd given when she first boarded, and walked back toward the camp. The second day of travel began much like the first had ended, muddy, uncomfortable, and tense. But something had shifted. Graceland found herself watching Fitzpatrick when she thought he wouldn't notice. The way he moved, economical and purposeful. The way he spoke, only when words were actually needed. The way his hands had felt on her shoulders, steady, anchoring. It frightened her, that awareness. She had buried her heart with Thomas 2 years ago. She had no intention of excavating it now. They reached Copper Ridge by afternoon, a settlement too small to be called a town. The stagecoach stop consisted of a lean-to, a well, and a woman selling dubious-looking meat pies. Graceland's stomach cramped with hunger, but when she calculated the cost of a pie against her remaining funds, she couldn't justify it. She was standing by the well, drinking water to fill the emptiness, when Fitzpatrick appeared beside her. "Not eating?" he asked. "Not hungry," she lied. He studied her for a moment, and she had the uncomfortable feeling he could see right through her. Then he walked to the woman selling pies, purchased 2, and brought one back to Graceland. "I can't," she started. "You can," he said simply. "You need to eat." "I can't pay you back." "I'm not asking you to." She wanted to refuse on principle, but the smell of the pie, even a dubious pie, was overwhelming. She accepted it with trembling hands. "Thank you," she said. "You've been very kind." "It's just a pie," he replied, but something in his expression suggested it wasn't just a pie at all. They ate in silence, standing by the well. The pie was terrible, the meat was of questionable origin, and the crust was leaden, but it was food, and Graceland was grateful for every bite. "Why are you going to Cedar Springs?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. Fitzpatrick took his time answering. "Business," he finally said. "What kind of business?" "The complicated kind." He glanced at her. "You're visiting family," Mrs. Brennan said. "My mother, she's ill." "I'm sorry." The words were simple, but they carried genuine feeling. Graceland found herself wanting to tell him more, about the estrangement, about Thomas, about the fear that she would arrive too late, and her last words to her mother would remain the angry ones spoken 2 years ago. But the driver was calling them back to the coach, and the moment passed. The afternoon brought better roads and brighter weather. They made good time, and spirits lifted accordingly. Even Mr. Whitmore stopped complaining. Mrs. Brennan dozed peacefully, and Graceland found herself relaxing for the first time since leaving Millbrook. She must have fallen asleep because when she woke, the sun was low on the horizon and her head was resting on something warm and solid. It took a confused moment to realize she had slumped sideways in her sleep and was now leaning against Fitzpatrick's shoulder. She jerked upright, mortified. "I'm so sorry." "It's fine," he said, his expression unreadable. "You needed the rest." "I shouldn't have—" "Mrs. Hudson." He turned to look at her directly. "It's fine, really." There was something in his eyes, a warmth, a gentleness, that made her breath catch. This was dangerous territory. She knew it instinctively. This man was dangerous, not because he meant her harm, but because he made her feel things she had sworn never to feel again. "We should arrive in Cedar Springs before nightfall," Mrs. Brennan announced, having woken from her own nap. "Thank goodness. I'm too old for this kind of journey." "Amen to that," Mr. Whitmore muttered. As promised, the town of Cedar Springs appeared on the horizon just as the sun touched the western hills. It was larger than Graceland had expected, a proper town with a main street, multiple cross streets, and buildings that looked permanent rather than hopeful. The coach pulled up in front of the Grand Hotel, which was neither grand nor much of a hotel, but it had a sign and a front door, which apparently qualified. The passengers disembarked with sighs of relief. "End of the line," the driver called. "Everyone out." Graceland climbed down on unsteady legs, her body protesting 2 days of constant jostling. She had no idea where her mother was staying, no plan beyond arriving. The $5 in her pocket suddenly felt impossibly inadequate. "Mrs. Hudson." She turned to find Fitzpatrick standing beside her, his small travel bag in hand. "Yes?" "Do you have somewhere to stay?" The question was casual, but his eyes were intent. Graceland considered lying, then decided against it. "I'll find something." "The boarding house on Maple Street is clean and cheap," he said. "Mrs. Chen runs it. Tell her Ryan Fitzpatrick sent you. She'll give you a fair rate." "You know her?" "I've stayed there before." It was more information than he'd volunteered about himself in 2 days. Graceland filed it away, adding to the small collection of facts she'd gathered. He knew these roads. He'd been to Cedar Springs before. His business was complicated, and his name was Ryan. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. The pie, the advice, last night during the storm. I don't think I properly thanked you for that." "No thanks necessary." He shifted his bag to his other hand. "I hope your mother recovers." "I hope your business goes well." They stood there awkwardly, two people who had shared a crisis but remained fundamentally strangers. Then Ryan nodded once, that same small gesture, and walked away down the street. Graceland watched him go, telling herself the hollow feeling in her chest was just exhaustion and hunger and stress. It had nothing to do with the quiet man disappearing into the crowds of Cedar Springs. Nothing at all. She asked at the hotel desk for directions to the boarding house, then for information about her mother. The clerk, a bored young man with ink-stained fingers, consulted a register. "Martha Hudson?" he read. "Yeah, she's been here about a week. Dr. Winters has been attending her. He's got an office on 2nd Street. Armed with this information, Graceland set out to find her mother, her heart heavy with dread and hope in equal measure. The streets of Cedar Springs were busy with evening commerce, shops closing, restaurants opening, people moving with purpose through the cooling air. Dr. Winters' office was a small building with a shingle hanging crookedly by the door. Graceland knocked, and after a moment, a gray-haired man with kind eyes answered. "Help you?" "I'm looking for Martha Hudson. I'm her daughter." His expression shifted to something like relief. "Mrs. Hudson! Yes, come in, come in. Your mother has been asking for you." He led her through a small waiting room into a back bedroom, and there, looking impossibly small in a large bed, was her mother. Martha Hudson had always been a force of nature, strong-willed, sharp-tongued, vibrant. The woman in the bed bore little resemblance to that memory. She had aged decades in 2 years, her face gaunt, her hair thin and gray, but her eyes, those were the same, bright and piercing. "Graceland," she whispered. "Mama." The word came out broken. Graceland crossed to the bed and took her mother's hand, shocked by how fragile it felt. I came as soon as I got your letter. Took you long enough, Martha said, but there was no heat in it, just exhaustion. Dr. Winters cleared his throat. I'll give you two some privacy. Mrs. Hudson, I'll be in the front room if you need anything. He left, closing the door softly behind him. Graceland sat on the edge of the bed, still holding her mother's hand, and tried to find words for everything she felt. I'm sorry, she finally said, for what I said, for staying away. I'm so sorry, Mama. Hush. Martha's grip tightened fractionally. We were both stubborn. That's the Hudson blood. Always has been. She paused, gathering strength. How are you managing? The farm? Graceland couldn't lie, not now. It's gone. The bank foreclosed last month. I've been living in town, taking in sewing. Her mother's eyes closed. I was afraid of that. Thomas left you in a difficult position. Thomas died, Mama. He didn't leave me anywhere. I know. Martha's eyes opened again. I know, baby. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything I said about him, about you marrying him. He made you happy, and that should have been enough for me. The tears Graceland had been holding back since the stagecoach finally fell. She cried silently, her shoulders shaking, while her mother stroked her hand with what little strength she had. Don't cry, Martha whispered. It's all going to be all right. But Graceland knew it wasn't. Her mother was dying. She had $5 to her name. She was alone in a strange town with no prospects and no future. Nothing was all right, and nothing was going to be all right. But she didn't say any of that. Instead, she wiped her eyes and asked, What did Dr. Winters say? The truth? My heart is giving out. It's been coming for a while. Martha managed a weak smile. Could be days, could be weeks, maybe a month if I'm unlucky. I've made my peace with it. I haven't. You will. Her mother shifted in the bed, wincing with pain. Listen to me, Graceland. I've arranged some things. The house in Millbrook. You sold it? 2 months ago. The money is in an account at the First Bank of Cedar Springs. It's yours now, all of it. Graceland's breath caught. How much? $800. $800. It was a fortune. It was survival. It was everything she needed and had been certain she would never have. Mama, I can't. You can and you will, Martha said firmly, showing a flash of her old strength. It's not charity. It's your inheritance, just coming a bit early. Use it wisely. Maybe start over somewhere new. Find some happiness if you can. They talked until Martha grew too tired to continue. Dr. Winters came back in and gently suggested Graceland find lodging for the night. He would send word if anything changed. Graceland walked through Cedar Springs in a daze. $800. The number kept echoing in her mind. She found the boarding house on Maple Street, a neat building with flower boxes in the windows, and knocked. The woman who answered was small and Chinese, with gray threading through her black hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. Help you? She asked. Mrs. Chen? Ryan Fitzpatrick said you might have a room available. Something shifted in the woman's expression. Mr. Fitzpatrick sent you. He was on my stagecoach from Millbrook. He mentioned you ran a clean establishment. Mrs. Chen studied her for a long moment. You look exhausted. Come in, I'll make tea. The room was small but spotlessly clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the street. Mrs. Chen quoted a rate that was more than fair, 50 cents a night, or $3 for a week. I'll take a week, Graceland said, counting out the money. Mr. Fitzpatrick is a good judge of character, Mrs. Chen said as she accepted the payment. If he sent you here, you must be a decent person. Do you know him well? Well enough. He stays here when he's in town. Quiet man, keeps to himself, but honest. You can always tell honest people. They don't need to talk much. She smiled. Breakfast is at 7. No men in the rooms, no drinking, no noise after 9. You need anything? You come find me. Graceland thanked her and climbed the stairs to her room. She sat on the bed and finally let herself process everything that had happened. Her mother was dying but had given her a future. She had money again, not wealth, but security. And somewhere in this town was a quiet man with gray eyes who had helped her through a storm. She thought about Ryan Fitzpatrick as she prepared for bed. Thought about the way he had anchored her during the panic attack, the way he had bought her a pie without making her feel like charity, the way it had felt to wake with her head on his shoulder. It was just loneliness, she told herself, the stress of the journey and the fear for her mother making her vulnerable to kindness. It meant nothing. But as she fell asleep in the narrow bed, with the sounds of Cedar Springs filtering through the window, she knew she was lying to herself. And somewhere in the same town, in another boarding house room, Ryan Fitzpatrick lay awake and thought about a woman with haunted eyes and muddy skirts who had fallen asleep on his shoulder and made him remember what it felt like to want to protect something fragile and precious. Neither of them knew that tomorrow would bring the first of many tests. Neither knew that the quiet man's complicated business was about to collide with the widow's uncertain future. Neither knew that the story that had begun on a mud-soaked road was just starting to unfold. All they knew was that sleep was hard to find, and morning would come whether they were ready or not. Morning arrived with the smell of fresh bread and the sound of cartwheels on cobblestone. Graceland woke disoriented, forgetting for a moment where she was. The narrow room, the unfamiliar ceiling, the distant church bells, it all came back in a rush. Cedar Springs. Her mother. $800 that felt both like salvation and blood money. She dressed quickly in her only clean dress, a simple brown cotton that had seen better years, and made her way downstairs. The boarding house dining room was small but cheerful, with checked curtains and mismatched chairs. 3 other guests sat at the long table, and Mrs. Chen moved between them with a coffee pot and plates of eggs and toast. "Morning," Mrs. Chen said, gesturing to an empty chair. "You sleep well?" "Well enough, thank you." The breakfast was simple but good, better than anything Graceland had eaten in months. She was halfway through her eggs when the front door opened and Ryan Fitzpatrick walked in. Their eyes met across the room. He paused fractionally in the doorway, surprise flickering across his face before he controlled it. "Mr. Fitzpatrick," Mrs. Chen said warmly, "your usual table." "Please." He moved to a small table by the window, nodding to Graceland as he passed. "Mrs. Hudson." "Mr. Fitzpatrick." The formality felt absurd after everything they'd shared on the stagecoach, but Graceland didn't know how else to navigate this. He was a stranger who had seen her at her worst. They had no claim on each other beyond 2 days of proximity and a few acts of kindness. She finished her breakfast quickly, uncomfortably aware of his presence across the room. When she stood to leave, Mrs. Chen appeared at her elbow. "Your mother doing better?" she asked quietly. Graceland blinked. "How did you know about my mother?" "Small town. Word travels." Mrs. Chen refilled her coffee cup even though Graceland hadn't asked. "Dr. Winters is a good man. She's in capable hands. Thank you." Graceland glanced toward Ryan's table, but he was focused on his breakfast, apparently oblivious to their conversation. "I should go see her." "Take some time for yourself too," Mrs. Chen advised. "Can't pour from an empty cup." It was kind advice, but Graceland had no idea how to follow it. She'd spent 2 years running on empty, and she'd forgotten what fullness felt like. Dr. Winter's office was already open when she arrived. He met her at the door with a grave expression that made her stomach drop. "She had a difficult night," he said without preamble. "Her breathing is labored. I've given her something for the pain, but Mrs. Hudson, you should prepare yourself." "How long?" "Days, maybe a week if we're fortunate." The word fortunate seemed grotesque in this context, but Graceland understood what he meant. She nodded and went to her mother's room. Martha was awake but clearly struggling. Each breath seemed to cost her. When she saw Graceland, she managed a weak smile. "There's my girl," she whispered. Graceland pulled a chair close to the bed and took her mother's hand. It felt impossibly fragile, all bone and papery skin. "I'm here, Mama." "Good. That's good." Martha's eyes drifted closed, then opened again with visible effort. "Need to tell you something about the property." "Mama, don't tire yourself." "Listen." The command carried a ghost of her old authority. "The house in Millbrook is sold, yes, but there's land, 20 acres outside Cedar Springs. Your father bought it years ago before you were born, been sitting empty ever since." Graceland's mind raced. "Land? Here?" "Good land. Water rights, creek runs through it." Martha paused to catch her breath. "It's yours now. Papers are with lawyer named Brennan, James Brennan, on 3rd Street. Brennan? Like Mrs. Brennan from the stagecoach? His mother, probably. Old family here. Another labored breath. The land is valuable, Grace. Don't let anyone take it from you. Men will try. They always do when a woman owns something worth having. I won't, Graceland promised, though she had no idea how to keep such a promise. They sat in silence for a while, Graceland holding her mother's hand while Martha drifted in and out of consciousness. Around noon, Dr. Winters brought broth and insisted Graceland eat something. She managed a few spoonfuls before her stomach rebelled. You should rest, the doctor said gently. I'll stay with her. If anything changes, I'll send for you immediately. Graceland didn't want to leave, but exhaustion was making her lightheaded. She agreed to go back to the boarding house for a few hours, making the doctor promise, twice, to send word if Martha worsened. The streets of Cedar Springs were busy with afternoon commerce. Graceland walked slowly, trying to process everything. Land, 20 acres, water rights. It should have felt like a blessing, but her mother's warning echoed in her mind. Men will try. They always do. She was so lost in thought that she nearly collided with someone coming out of the general store. Careful there, Mrs. Hudson. She looked up into Ryan Fitzpatrick's concerned face. He was carrying a paper-wrapped package and wearing a different shirt than at breakfast. This one, a faded blue that made his gray eyes more pronounced. I'm sorry, she said. I wasn't paying attention. Everything all right? Your mother? She's the same. Maybe worse. The doctor said days. The words tumbled out before she could stop them. She told me about land, property she owned here. 20 acres I didn't know existed. Something flickered in Ryan's expression, gone too quickly to identify. That's the Morrison Creek property. Graceland stared at him. You know it? Everyone in Cedar Springs knows it. Prime land. Creek runs year-round, good grazing, timber on the back acres. He shifted the package to his other arm. Your mother owned it? Apparently my father bought it before I was born. I had no idea. She studied his face, trying to read his reaction. You seem to know a lot about it. I know land. It's part of my business. That word again. Business. The complicated kind. Graceland felt a small twist of unease in her stomach. What exactly is your business, Mr. Fitzpatrick? He met her gaze directly. Land acquisition, property development. I work for investors who want to expand into frontier territories. The unease crystallized into something sharper. You buy land from people. Sometimes, when they want to sell. And when they don't want to sell? His jaw tightened fractionally. Then I don't buy it. I'm not in the business of forcing anyone, Mrs. Hudson. They stood on the boardwalk, afternoon sun slanting between them, and Graceland felt the careful distance they'd maintained since the stagecoach suddenly become a chasm. He was a land buyer. She now owned valuable land. The timing was too coincidental to be comfortable. Did you know? She asked quietly. On the stagecoach. Did you know who I was? About the land? No. The answer was immediate and firm. I had no idea who you were until Mrs. Brennan mentioned your name, and even then, I didn't connect you to the Morrison Creek property until just now. But you knew about the property before. Yes, it's been on my list of potential acquisitions for months, but I didn't know your mother owned it, and I certainly didn't know you existed. He paused. If you think I helped you during the storm, bought you that pie because I wanted to soften you up for a business deal, you're wrong. Then why did you help me? The question hung between them. Ryan's expression shifted through several emotions before settling on something that looked almost like resignation. Because you needed help, he said simply, and because I wanted to. Before Graceland could respond, a man's voice called out from across the street. Fitzpatrick, there you are. They both turned to see a well-dressed man approaching, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of confidence that came from money and privilege. He wore an expensive suit and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Mr. Carver, Ryan said, his tone carefully neutral. The man, Carver, reached them and clapped Ryan on the shoulder with false familiarity. Been looking for you all morning. We need to discuss the Morrison Creek situation. His gaze slid to Graceland. And who's this lovely lady? Mrs. Graceland Hudson, Ryan said before she could introduce herself. Mrs. Hudson, this is Douglas Carver. He's one of the investors I work for. Carver's smile widened, but his eyes sharpened with interest. Hudson? Any relation to Martha Hudson? She's my mother. Ah. He drew the sound out, laden with meaning. Then you're the property owner. How convenient. Fitzpatrick, you didn't tell me you'd already made contact. I haven't, Ryan said, and Graceland heard steel beneath the calm. Mrs. Hudson and I met on the stagecoach from Millbrook. This encounter is coincidental. Of course, of course. Carver's tone suggested he believed nothing of the sort. He turned his full attention to Graceland. Mrs. Hudson, I'm very sorry to hear about your mother's illness. Terrible thing, but perhaps we can discuss the Morrison Creek property. I'm prepared to make a very generous offer. My mother isn't dead yet, Graceland said, her voice colder than she'd intended. Of course not. Forgive me, I didn't mean to imply. I simply wanted to express interest should you decide to sell. 20 acres is a lot for a woman to manage alone. There it was, the assumption, the condescension wrapped in concern. Graceland felt her spine straighten. I haven't decided anything, Mr. Carver, and I won't be making any decisions while my mother is dying. Naturally, I understand completely. He pulled a card from his pocket and offered it to her. When you're ready to discuss it, please come find me. I'm staying at the Grand Hotel. We can negotiate terms that would be very favorable to you. Graceland took the card because refusing seemed more trouble than it was worth. Thank you. Carver tipped his hat. Fitzpatrick, my office. 1 hour. Then he walked away, his expensive boots clicking on the boardwalk. The silence he left behind felt heavy. Graceland looked down at the card, embossed, expensive, then at Ryan. Does he always operate like that? She asked, approaching grieving families to buy their land. He operates however he thinks will be effective. Ryan's expression was unreadable. Mrs. Hudson, I should clarify something. Carver is one of several investors I work for. I research properties, assess their value, handle negotiations when owners are willing to sell. But I don't work exclusively for him, and I don't operate the way he does. But you were planning to try to buy my mother's land. I was planning to research who owned it and whether they might be interested in selling. There's a difference. Is there? He studied her for a long moment. I'd like to think so, but I understand if you don't see it that way. A wagon rattled past, breaking the moment. Graceland realized they were drawing stares from passers-by. A well-dressed man and a woman in a worn brown dress, having an intense conversation on a public street. I should go, she said. Thank you for the information about the land. Mrs. Hudson. I need to think, Mr. Fitzpatrick, about everything. Alone. She walked away before he could respond, feeling his gaze on her back. The encounter had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. Ryan Fitzpatrick wasn't who she'd thought he was. Or rather, he was exactly who he'd said he was. A businessman with complicated interests. And she was suddenly the owner of something he wanted. The boarding house felt like sanctuary. Graceland went to her room and sat on the narrow bed, trying to organize her thoughts. 20 acres, valuable land, multiple investors interested. And somewhere in the middle of it all, a quiet man with gray eyes who had held her through a panic attack and was now professionally obligated to try to convince her to sell. She should have felt angry, betrayed maybe. Instead, she just felt tired and confused and overwhelmingly alone. A knock at the door interrupted her spiral. Mrs. Hudson, Mrs. Chen's voice, you have a visitor downstairs. Graceland's heart jumped. The doctor? Had something happened to her mother? She hurried downstairs to find not Dr. Winters, but an older gentleman in a slightly rumpled suit waiting in the parlor. Mrs. Hudson, I'm James Brennan, your mother's lawyer. Recognition clicked. Mrs. Brennan's son? Indeed. My mother spoke highly of you when she returned yesterday, said you were courteous and kind despite obvious distress. He gestured to a chair. May we sit? I have matters to discuss regarding your mother's estate. They settled in the small parlor, and Brennan produced a leather folder from his bag. Your mother has been preparing for this eventuality, he said gently. She wanted everything in order so you wouldn't have additional burdens during your grief. The Morrison Creek property is deeded in your name as of last week, all legal and proper. Additionally, the funds from the Millbrook house sale are in your account at First Bank. Here are the relevant documents. He spread papers across the small table: deeds, bank statements, letters of authentication. Graceland stared at them, overwhelmed. The land has been vacant for years, Brennan continued, but it's valuable. The creek provides year-round water, which is increasingly rare in these parts. Several parties have expressed interest in purchasing it over the years. Like Douglas Carver? Brennan's expression soured. Among others. Carver is particularly persistent. He represents Eastern investors looking to acquire large tracts for cattle operations. He's approached your mother multiple times, and she refused him every time. Why? She never said specifically, but Martha Hudson was a shrewd woman. If she held on to that land for 30 years despite numerous offers, she had her reasons. He paused. Mrs. Hudson, I feel obligated to warn you. Carver doesn't handle rejection well. He may pressure you to sell, especially now when you're vulnerable. Don't let him bully you into anything. I won't. Good. Brennan gathered the papers back into a neat stack. These are yours. Keep them safe, and if you need legal counsel for anything at all, you come to me. Your mother was a dear friend. Helping her daughter is an honor, not a burden. After he left, Graceland sat with the papers in her lap, feeling the weight of them. She owned land, she had money in the bank, she had options, possibilities, a future that wasn't just survival, but her mother was dying, and none of it felt real. She returned to Dr. Winters' office as the sun began its descent. Martha was worse. Anyone could see that. Her breathing had become a terrible rattling sound, and she barely woke when Graceland entered. Mama, Graceland whispered, taking her hand. I'm here, shh. Martha's eyes opened fractionally. Grace. The word was barely audible. Promise me, don't sell the land, not to Carver. I promise, Mama, I won't. Good girl. So proud of you. Her eyes closed again. Thomas would be proud too. Graceland's throat closed. She hadn't expected her mother to mention Thomas, not now. Mama, loved you, both of you. Should have said it more. Martha's breathing hitched. Land is your future. Don't give it away. For any man. I won't. I promise. They sat in the gathering darkness, mother and daughter, while life slowly ebbed. Dr. Winters came in periodically to check on Martha, each time meeting Graceland's eyes with increasing gravity. Around midnight, Martha's breathing changed. The rattling became quieter, more irregular. Dr. Winters stayed in the room, standing respectfully by the door. Mama? Graceland leaned close. Can you hear me? A slight pressure on her hand. Yes. I love you. I forgive you for everything, and I'm so sorry for my own stubbornness. Thank you for the land, for the money, for giving me a chance. I won't waste it, I promise. Martha's lips moved. Graceland bent closer to hear. Be happy. They were the last words Martha Hudson spoke. An hour later, as the clock struck 1, her breathing simply stopped. Graceland sat holding her mother's hand for a long time after, feeling the warmth slowly leave her skin. Dr. Winters waited patiently, then gently suggested he notify the undertaker. I'll make the arrangements, he said. You should get some rest, Mrs. Hudson. There will be much to do tomorrow. Graceland walked back to the boarding house in a fog. The night was clear and cold, stars scattered across the sky with indifferent beauty. Her mother was dead. The thought kept circling, unable to land properly. Her mother was dead, and she was truly alone now. Mrs. Chen was waiting up. She took one look at Graceland's face and wordlessly made tea, then sat with her at the kitchen table while Graceland stared at nothing. My mother died when I was 23, Mrs. Chen said quietly. Crossing the ocean from China. I wanted to die too, for a while after, but she would have been angry with me for that. She didn't cross an ocean so I could give up. I don't know how to do this, Graceland whispered. Any of this. One day at a time. 1 hour at a time if you need to. And you accept help when it's offered. Mrs. Chen poured more tea. You're not as alone as you think. The funeral was arranged for 3 days later, enough time to notify anyone who might want to attend, though Graceland couldn't imagine who that would be. Her mother had lived in Cedar Springs only briefly, years ago, and most old friends were dead or gone. She spent those 3 days in a strange limbo, handling arrangements with Dr. Winters and Brennan, trying to eat when Mrs. Chen insisted, sleeping fitfully in the narrow boarding house bed. People brought food. It seemed to be what people did when someone died. Casseroles and breads and mysterious covered dishes appeared at the boarding house daily. Ryan Fitzpatrick appeared on the second day. Graceland was sitting in the boarding house parlor, staring at papers she needed to sign, when Mrs. Chen showed him in. "Mr. Fitzpatrick to see you," she announced, then disappeared with unusual tact. He stood in the doorway, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable. "Mrs. Hudson, I heard about your mother. I'm very sorry." "Thank you." An awkward silence stretched. Ryan shifted his weight. "I wanted to say, if there's anything you need, anything at all, you have only to ask." "Why?" The question came out sharper than she'd intended. "Because you want to buy my land?" "No. Because you're grieving and alone in a strange town, and I'd like to help if I can. Even though I own something your employer wants?" He met her eyes directly. "Yes. Even though." Graceland wanted to believe him. Some part of her desperately wanted to believe that the man who had talked her through a panic attack, who had bought her a pie, who had let her fall asleep on his shoulder, was real and not just a businessman cultivating a potential client. "I don't know what's real anymore," she said quietly. "I don't know who to trust." "I understand." He turned his hat in his hands. "For what it's worth, I've told Carver I won't be handling any negotiation regarding the Morrison Creek property, conflict of interest." "Because we traveled together on the stagecoach?" "Because I don't want business considerations affecting our acquaintance." The careful word choice didn't escape her notice. Acquaintance, not friendship, not anything more significant, just two people who happen to know each other. "That's probably wise," Graceland said. He nodded, set his hat back on his head. "The funeral is tomorrow?" 2:00. "I'll be there, if that's acceptable to you." It should have felt inappropriate, a virtual stranger attending her mother's funeral, but the thought of facing it completely alone was worse. "It's acceptable." After he left, Graceland sat with the documents she was supposed to sign, her mother's warnings echoing in her head. Don't sell the land, not to Carver. Men will try, they always do. The funeral was small. Dr. Winters attended, and Brennan the lawyer, and Mrs. Chen. A few townspeople Graceland didn't know came out of respect for Dr. Winters. And in the back, wearing a dark suit she'd never seen him in, stood Ryan Fitzpatrick. The minister, a young man who'd never met Martha, spoke generic words about eternal rest and loving families. Graceland barely heard them. She stood by the grave in her mourning black, borrowed from Mrs. Chen since she owned nothing suitable, and tried to feel something beyond numbness. Afterward, people offered condolences and departed quickly. Only Ryan lingered as the gravediggers began their work. "Your mother was buried beside your father?" he asked quietly. Graceland nodded. "She arranged it. They were married 40 years. She wanted to be with him." "That's a long time to love someone." "Yes." They stood in silence, watching the grave being filled. When it was done, Graceland placed a small bunch of wildflowers, the only thing she could afford, on the fresh earth. "She told me to be happy," she said suddenly. Her last words. "Be happy." "I don't even know what that means anymore." Ryan turned to look at her. "It means whatever you decide it means. That's the gift of it." They walked back toward town together, not speaking. The afternoon sun was warm, incongruously cheerful. Life continued despite death. The world kept turning. "I need to make decisions," Graceland said as they reached the boarding house. "About the land, about my future, but I don't know where to start." "Start with what you want, not what you think you should want, or what would be practical. What do you actually want?" It was a harder question than it should have been. Graceland had spent so long just surviving that wanting seemed like a luxury she couldn't afford. "I want to stop being afraid," she finally said. I want to build something that can't be taken away. I want, she paused, surprised by her own honesty. I want to matter, to leave something behind that says I was here. Ryan's expression shifted, something warm and almost proud flickering across his face. Then hold on to that land. 20 acres isn't just property, it's possibility. That's not what Carver would say, or you probably if this were a business conversation. No. If this were a business conversation, I'd point out that managing land requires capital, knowledge, and connections you don't have. I'd suggest that selling to experienced operators would be wiser. I'd make a compelling argument for why letting go is the smart choice. He met her eyes. But this isn't a business conversation. This is one person asking another what they want. And sometimes the smart choice and the right choice aren't the same thing. Before Graceland could respond, a familiar voice called out, "Mrs. Hudson!" They turned to see Douglas Carver approaching, flanked by two men Graceland didn't recognize. His smile was broad and entirely fake. "I heard about your mother. Tragic loss. Truly tragic." He didn't sound remotely sincere. "I wanted to reiterate my offer for the Morrison Creek property. In fact, I've increased it. $3,000, cash payment, immediate transfer." $3,000. It was more than Graceland had imagined the land was worth. It was security, freedom, possibility. "Mr. Carver," Ryan said, his voice hard, "this is hardly the time. I'm not talking to you, Fitzpatrick. Mrs. Hudson, that's a generous offer, more than generous. I'd hate for you to make an emotional decision you'd regret." Graceland looked at the three men standing before her, Carver smug and confident, his associates looming like threats, and Ryan tense with barely controlled anger. She thought about her mother's warning. She thought about what she wanted. "No," she said clearly. Carver's smile faltered. "I'm sorry?" "No, I'm not selling. Not now. Probably not ever. The land stays mine." "Mrs. Hudson, be reasonable." "I'm being perfectly reasonable. The answer is no." Something ugly flashed in Carver's eyes before he controlled it. "You're making a mistake. A woman alone can't manage property like that. You'll be begging me to buy it within 6 months. Then I suppose you'll have your answer in 6 months. Good day, Mr. Carver." She turned and walked into the boarding house, her heart pounding. Through the window, she watched Ryan say something sharp to Carver, then follow her inside. "That was brave," he said quietly. "Or stupid. Sometimes they're the same thing." He paused. "He won't let this go easily." "I know." Graceland felt the weight of what she'd just done settling onto her shoulders. "But my mother held on to that land for 30 years despite people like him. I can manage at least 6 months." "You're not alone in this. I meant what I said. If you need help, ask." "Why would you help me keep land that your employer wants to buy?" Ryan smiled. A real smile, the first she'd seen from him. It transformed his face completely. "Because you remind me why I got into this business in the first place. It wasn't to help men like Carver get richer. It was because I believe land matters. Who owns it, what they do with it, it shapes the future. And I'd rather see that future shaped by someone who actually cares than someone who just sees dollar signs." The honesty in his voice made something crack in Graceland's carefully maintained composure. She'd been holding herself together through sheer will, and suddenly it was all too much. The funeral, the confrontation, the impossible decisions, and this man who kept appearing at crucial moments and saying exactly what she needed to hear. "I don't know what I'm doing," she admitted. "I've never owned land. I barely kept a farm running when I had a husband to help. I'm going to fail at this." "Maybe. Or maybe you'll surprise yourself." Ryan stepped closer, and Graceland could see concern in his gray eyes. "Give yourself credit, Mrs. Hudson. You've survived things that would have broken other people. You can survive this too." Standing in the boarding house parlor, with her mother fresh in the ground and an uncertain future stretching ahead, Graceland made a decision. She could keep running on fear and caution, or she could try something different. Trust, maybe, or at least the possibility of it. "Will you help me?" she asked. "Not as a business arrangement, but as a friend. Help me figure out what to do with this land." Ryan's expression softened. Yes, I will. On one condition. What? Stop calling me Mr. Fitzpatrick. My name is Ryan. For the first time in days, Graceland felt something almost like warmth in her chest. Then you should call me Graceland. Graceland. He said it carefully, like he was testing how it felt. It suits you. Outside, the afternoon was fading into evening. Cedar Springs settled into its nightly rhythms. Shops closing, lamps being lit, families gathering for supper. And in the boarding house parlor, two people who had started as strangers on a muddy road were beginning to become something else entirely. Neither knew exactly what that something was yet. But for the first time since the stagecoach had left Millbrook, the future felt like it might hold more than just survival. It might hold possibility. The next morning, Ryan arrived at the boarding house with a horse and buggy just after breakfast. Graceland was still finishing her coffee when Mrs. Chen called her to the parlor. "We're going to see the land," he said without preamble. "If you're going to keep it, you need to know what you actually own." Graceland hesitated. The thought of being alone with him, away from the safety of town, stirred something complicated in her chest. But he was right. She'd inherited 20 acres she'd never seen, and ignorance was its own kind of danger. "Let me get my shawl," she said. They drove out of Cedar Springs in comfortable silence, the morning sun warming the air. The town gave way to open prairie, and Graceland found herself watching Ryan's hands on the reins, steady, competent, the same hands that had caught her in the mud and held her through the storm. "How long have you been in the land business?" she asked, more to break her own thoughts than from real curiosity. 8 years. Started as a surveyor's assistant in Colorado, learned the trade, eventually started working acquisitions. He glanced at her. "It's honest work, mostly, connecting people who want to sell with people who want to buy. But men like Carver make it feel dirty sometimes." "Why do you work for him?" "I work for several investors. Carver pays well, and until recently, I told myself that what they did with the land after they bought it wasn't my concern." His jaw tightened. "I'm reconsidering that position." They turned off the main road onto a barely visible track. The landscape shifted, more trees, the sound of running water growing louder. Then they crested a small rise, and Graceland saw it. The land spread before them like a promise. 20 acres of gentle slopes and meadow grass, bisected by a creek that sparkled in the morning light. Cottonwood trees lined the water, their leaves rustling in the breeze. In the distance, she could see the darker green of timber, valuable timber, she realized with a start. "Oh," she breathed. Ryan pulled the buggy to a stop. "Morrison Creek. Your property runs from that fence line," he pointed west, "to those rocks by the big cottonwood. North to south, it follows the creek bed." They climbed down, and Graceland walked slowly toward the water. The grass was thick and green, fed by the creek's generosity. She could see where cattle had grazed at some point. The grass was trimmed in places, though no animals were visible now. "Someone's been using it," she said. "Adjacent property owner, probably. When land sits empty, neighbors tend to help themselves." Ryan followed her to the creek bank. "But that stops now. This is yours, and you have every right to fence it, lease it, or develop it however you choose." Graceland knelt by the water and dipped her fingers in. It was cold and clear, running fast over smooth stones. She could hear birds in the cottonwoods, see fish darting in the shallows. It was beautiful in a way that made her chest ache. "My father bought this," she said quietly, "before I was born. He never told me about it. Maybe he was saving it for the right moment. Or maybe he forgot. He was good at that, starting things and not finishing them." She stood, brushing dirt from her skirts. "My mother held on to it, though, through everything. She must have had a reason." They walked the property line, Ryan pointing out features. The timber stand, the natural spring that fed the creek, the level ground perfect for building. Graceland tried to see it through practical eyes, but all she could see was possibility. A place to build something permanent. A future that didn't depend on anyone else's charity or tolerance. "What would it take to make this productive?" she asked. "Actually productive, I mean. Not just letting neighbors graze their cattle." Ryan stopped walking and turned to face her. "Honestly? Capital first. You'd need fencing, at minimum. Maybe a small structure." shelter for animals if you want to run your own stock, or a cabin if you want to live here. You'd need to file water rights officially, make sure they're protected, and you'd need either knowledge or hired help to manage it. How much capital? Minimum? $500, more if you want to do it right. Graceland did the math in her head. She had $800 from her mother's house sale, $500 for the land left, $300 for living expenses, emergencies, unforeseen disasters. It was tight, frighteningly tight. What if I leased it instead, she asked. Let someone else graze cattle, pay me rent. You could, but lease rates are low, and you'd be giving up control. The lessee could overgraze, damage the land, make it less valuable long term. He paused, and men like Carver would see it as weakness. They'd pressure your lessee to break the agreement, make it untenable, force you to sell. So my choices are spend everything I have on a gamble, or slowly lose what I own to men who think women can't hold property. Those aren't your only choices. They're just the obvious ones. She turned to look at him. What are the non-obvious ones? Find a partner, someone with knowledge and resources who can help you develop the land properly. Split the profits, maintain control, build something sustainable. Where would I find someone like that? Ryan met her eyes, and something passed between them, an understanding, a possibility, a risk neither had fully acknowledged yet. You're looking at him, he said quietly. Graceland's breath caught. You want to partner with me? I want to help you keep what's yours. And yes, if that means a formal partnership, I'm offering. He held up a hand before she could respond. Before you say anything, let me be clear about terms. You retain majority ownership, 60% to my 40%. You make all final decisions. I provide expertise, labor, and initial capital for development. Profit split according to ownership percentage. Everything legal and documented through Brennan. It was a generous offer, too generous. Graceland's instincts, honed by 2 years of hardship and betrayal, screamed warnings. Why? She asked. Why would you do this? What do you get out of it besides 40% of undefined future profits? Land I can develop the right way. A project that actually means something instead of just making rich men richer, and he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. The chance to prove that not every man in this business is like Douglas Carver. That's not enough reason to risk your capital. Maybe not for most people. But I told you, I'm reconsidering my positions. On a lot of things. The weight of the offer settled over Graceland like a physical thing. This could be salvation or disaster. Partnership with a man she barely knew, tying her future to his competence and integrity. Every practical bone in her body said to refuse, to play it safe, to keep her independence even if it meant losing everything. But her mother's voice echoed in her memory. Be happy. And happiness, Graceland was beginning to understand, sometimes required terrifying leaps of faith. I need time to think about it, she said. Of course. Take all the time you need. Ryan walked back toward the buggy. But while you're thinking, consider this. You can't develop this land alone. You need help. The question isn't whether to accept help, it's who to accept it from. At least with me, you know where you stand. They drove back to Cedar Springs mostly in silence, but it felt different than the morning's quiet, charged with possibility and fear in equal measure. When Ryan left her at the boarding house, he tipped his hat formally. Think it over. And Graceland? Whatever you decide, I meant what I said. If you need help, you have only to ask. She spent the afternoon walking through Cedar Springs, trying to clear her head. The town was busier than she'd expected, a proper frontier settlement with ambitions of becoming something more. She passed the bank, the courthouse, the new school building under construction. People nodded to her on the street, some offering quiet condolences about her mother. At the mercantile, she bought supplies she didn't need just to have something normal to do. The shopkeeper, a motherly woman named Mrs. Patterson, packaged her purchases with practiced efficiency. Heard you own the Morrison Creek property now, she said conversationally. That's prime land. Your mother was smart to hold on to it. Everyone seems to know about my land, Graceland observed. Small town, people talk. Mrs. Patterson leaned across the counter conspiratorially. They're also saying Douglas Carver is mighty interested in buying it. You be careful with that one, dear. He's not above using dirty tactics when he wants something. What kind of tactics? Oh,
Harassment, mostly. Making life difficult for people until they give up and sell. Had a widow last year, owned a small plot by the railroad. Carver wanted it for a depot. When she refused to sell, suddenly she couldn't get credit anywhere. Her suppliers raised prices, the bank called in loans. She held out for 6 months before the pressure broke her. The story chilled Graceland more than she wanted to admit. What happened to her? Sold for half what Carver originally offered and moved back east. Last I heard, Carver built his depot and made a fortune on it. Mrs. Patterson straightened, her expression hardening. But you've got something she didn't, Ryan Fitzpatrick on your side. That man's got a reputation for honest dealing. If he's helping you, you'll be all right.
Graceland left the mercantile with more questions than she'd entered with. Everyone in Cedar Springs seemed to have opinions about her land, about Carver, about Ryan. The attention was overwhelming for someone who'd spent 2 years trying to be invisible. She was walking past the saloon when she heard voices in the alley beside it, low and tense. Curiosity overrode caution, and she paused near the corner, hidden by shadows. Telling you she won't sell. That was Ryan's voice, tight with anger. Then make her sell. Douglas Carver. That's what I pay you for, Fitzpatrick, to acquire land. I told you I won't handle this acquisition. Find someone else. Why? Because you've gone soft on the widow? Carver's voice turned mocking. Or is it more than that? You thinking with something other than your head? The sound of movement, sudden and violent. Graceland risked a glance around the corner and saw Ryan had Carver pressed against the wall, his forearm across the other man's throat. Listen carefully, Ryan said, his voice deadly quiet. You can question my professional judgment. You can fire me. You can hire someone else to harass Mrs. Hudson, but you will not speak about her with disrespect. Are we clear? Carver's face was red, but he managed a nod. Ryan released him and stepped back. Consider our professional relationship terminated, Ryan said. I'll send my final invoice by week's end. You're making a mistake. That woman has you twisted up. You're throwing away a lucrative position for something that actually matters. Yes, I am. Ryan walked away, and Graceland barely had time to press herself back into the shadows before he passed. She caught a glimpse of his face, jaw clenched, eyes hard with something like fury, before he disappeared around the corner. Her heart was racing. He'd quit, terminated his relationship with Carver. For her. The realization was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. She waited until Carver had also left the alley, muttering curses and straightening his jacket, before emerging from her hiding place. Her hands were shaking. Everything was happening too fast. A week ago, she'd been a widow struggling to survive in Millbrook. Now she owned valuable land, had rejected a powerful man's offer, and had somehow become the center of a conflict between business rivals. And somewhere in all of it, a quiet man with river-stone eyes was choosing her side. She found Ryan at the boarding house that evening. He was sitting in the parlor with Mrs. Chen, both of them drinking tea and speaking in low voices. When Graceland entered, they both looked up. I'll leave you two alone, Mrs. Chen said, standing with surprising tact. She paused by Graceland on her way out. Whatever you're deciding, trust your instincts. They've kept you alive this long. Then she was gone, and Graceland was alone with Ryan in the lamp-lit parlor. I heard what happened with Carver, she said without preamble. Ryan's expression didn't change. Of course you did. Small town. You quit because of me. I quit because continuing to work for him while helping you would be a conflict of interest, and because I was tired of helping men like him take advantage of people. That's a very practical explanation for what sounded like a very personal confrontation. He looked at her directly. All right. Yes. It was personal. He spoke disrespectfully about you, and I didn't appreciate it. Does that satisfy your curiosity? It terrifies me, Graceland said honestly. She sat in the chair Mrs. Chen had vacated, suddenly exhausted. Everything about this terrifies me. A week ago, I had nothing. Now I have land and money, and you offering partnership and Carver as an enemy, and I don't know how to navigate any of it. Then let me help you learn. Why should I trust you? I barely know you. You know I pulled you through a panic attack on the stagecoach. You know I bought you food when you were hungry. You know I stood beside you at your mother's funeral. You know I just ended a lucrative professional relationship rather than compromise helping you. He leaned forward, his eyes intense.
What else do you need to know? I need to know you're not just another man trying to take what's mine. The words hung in the air between them, laden with all the hurt and betrayal Graceland had endured. Ryan's expression softened. I can't prove that with words, he said quietly. Only with actions over time. But Graceland, I'm not asking you to give me anything. I'm offering to help you keep what's already yours. There's a difference. She wanted to believe him. That was the most dangerous part. She wanted to believe that this man was exactly who he appeared to be, honest, competent, genuinely interested in her welfare. But wanting and trusting were different things. Your partnership offer, she said. I want to accept it, but I need guarantees. Name them. Everything in writing, legally binding, reviewed by Brennan before I sign anything. I maintain final decision-making authority on all aspects of the land, and if at any point I want to buy out your share, you agree to sell at fair market value. Done. Anything else? Yes. She met his eyes. I need to understand what's happening between us. The partnership is one thing, but there's something else, and I need to know if I'm imagining it. Ryan went very still. You're not imagining it. Then what is it? I don't know yet. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration that made him seem suddenly younger. I didn't expect this. Any of this. I got on that stagecoach planning a routine trip to Cedar Springs for business. Then you climbed aboard looking like you were carrying the weight of the world, and something just shifted. That's not an answer. I know. I don't have a better one. All I know is that I've spent 8 years keeping my professional and personal lives completely separate, and in less than a week, you've demolished that separation. He smiled, but it was tight. It's inconvenient as hell, honestly. Despite everything, Graceland felt a small laugh escape. Inconvenient. That's one word for it. What word would you use? She considered. Terrifying, confusing, impossible. Also accurate. They sat in the lamplight, two people trying to navigate something neither understood. Finally, Graceland made a decision. All right, we'll be partners, legally, professionally, everything documented and proper. But the other thing, whatever's happening between us, we don't act on it. Not yet. Not until I know if I can trust you completely. Fair enough. How long do I have to prove myself? As long as it takes. Then I'd better start now. Ryan stood and offered his hand formally. Partners? Graceland stood and took his hand. His grip was warm and firm, and she felt that same flutter of connection she'd felt on the stagecoach. Partners. The next week passed in a blur of activity. Brennan drew up partnership documents that protected Graceland's interests so thoroughly that even she was impressed. Ryan hired a surveyor to formally map the property boundaries and document the water rights. They met with the bank about establishing accounts for the partnership's operating expenses, and slowly, carefully, they began planning how to develop the land. First priority is fencing, Ryan said, spreading a map across the table in the boarding house dining room. Mrs. Chen had given them permission to use it as a makeshift office. We secure the boundaries, make it clear the land is actively managed. That stops neighbors from grazing their cattle and sends a message to Carver that you're serious about keeping it. How much will fencing cost? $200 for materials, another $100 for labor if we hire it out. Or we could do it ourselves and save the labor costs. Graceland looked at him skeptically. You know how to build fence? I spent 3 years working ranches before I got into land acquisition. I know my way around a fence post. He traced the creek line on the map. After fencing, we need to decide what to do with the land. Cattle is the obvious choice. There's good grazing, water access, existing market demand, but there are other options. Like what? Timber, for one. That stand on the north section is valuable. We could selectively harvest, sell to the sawmill in town. Or hay, the meadow grass is thick enough for multiple cuts per season. We could sell to other ranchers, build steady income. The possibilities spun through Graceland's mind. Each option had appeal and risk. What do you think we should do? I think we should diversify. Run a small herd.
maybe 20 head to start. Harvest timber selectively, cut hay from the meadow, build multiple income streams so we're not dependent on any single market. That sounds expensive. Initial outlay would be significant, yes, but the returns would be steady and sustainable. He pulled out a ledger he'd been keeping. I've done the calculations. If we invest $500 now, we should break even within 18 months and start showing profit by year 2. Graceland studied the numbers, impressed despite herself. Ryan had thought this through thoroughly, considered variables she wouldn't have known to account for. What if something goes wrong? She asked. Cattle prices drop. Timber market collapses. Drought kills the hay crop? Then we adapt. That's the benefit of diversification. If one income stream fails, others can compensate. He looked at her seriously. Graceland, I won't lie to you. This is a gamble. But it's a calculated one, based on sound principles and market research. I believe it can work. And if it doesn't? Then we lose money and have to start over. But you'll still own the land. That's the foundation everything else is built on. She made her decision. All right, let's do it. But we start small, one phase at a time. Prove each step works before moving to the next. Smart. Conservative? I like it. Ryan made notes in his ledger. We'll start with fencing next week. I've already contacted a supplier in Denver. Materials should arrive in 10 days. The fencing began on a bright Monday morning. Ryan arrived at dawn with tools, posts, and wire loaded in a wagon. Graceland met him wearing her oldest dress and boots she'd borrowed from Mrs. Chen. You don't have to help with this, Ryan said, though he looked pleased to see her. It's hard work. It's my land. I want to be part of building it. They worked side by side through the morning, digging post holes in the hard prairie earth. It was brutal labor. Graceland's hands blistered within an hour, and her back screamed in protest. But there was something satisfying about it, too. Each post they set was a claim, a declaration that this land belonged to her and she wasn't letting go. By midday, they'd completed the west property line. They sat in the shade of a cottonwood, sharing water and the lunch Mrs. Chen had packed, while sweat dried on their skin. You're tougher than you look, Ryan observed. I've had to be. Tell me about your husband, Thomas. The question was unexpected. Graceland stiffened. Why? Because he's clearly important to your story, and if we're partners, friends. I should know. Friends. The word settled into the space between them, both too much and not enough. Graceland considered refusing to answer, then decided against it. If she wanted honesty from Ryan, she needed to offer it herself. Thomas was good, she said quietly. Not perfect. He gambled sometimes, made poor investments, dreamed bigger than his abilities, but he was kind, and he loved me, and he tried. We had 3 years together before he died. What happened? Accident. He was mending fence, ironic, I suppose, and his horse spooked. He was thrown, broke his neck, dead before I found him. The words came out flat, stripped of emotion through repetition. The farm was mortgaged to the hilt. Thomas had borrowed to buy equipment, cattle, seeds for crops that never came in. When he died, I couldn't make the payments. The bank foreclosed. My mother and I had been estranged over my marriage. She thought I was throwing myself away on a dreamer, so I had nowhere to go, no one to ask for help. I took in sewing, lived in a rented room in Millbrook, and tried to survive. I'm sorry. Everyone's sorry. It doesn't change anything. She took a long drink of water. I loved him, but I won't make the mistake of depending on someone like that again. The farm should have been in both our names. I should have understood the finances. I should have been prepared for the possibility of loss. I wasn't, and I paid for that ignorance with 2 years of barely surviving. Ryan was quiet for a long moment. Is that why you insisted on majority ownership in our partnership? Why you want everything documented so carefully? Partly, but also because I've learned that people change, intentions shift. What feels right in the moment can become complicated later. Legal protections aren't romantic, but they're necessary. I agree completely, which is why I suggested formal documentation in the first place. He stood and offered his hand to help her up. Come on, we've got more fence to build before sunset. They worked through the afternoon, falling into an easy rhythm. Ryan would dig the hole, Graceland would set the post, they'd work together to pack it firm. Little conversation was needed. Their bodies learned to coordinate, anticipate, work as a unit. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the prairie, they stood back to survey their progress. The fence line ran straight and true, marking clear boundaries where before there had been only grass and hope. "It's a start," Ryan said. "It's more than that. It's real." They were loading tools back into the wagon when a rider appeared on the horizon. As he drew closer, Graceland recognized one of Carver's men from the funeral, a rough-looking individual with cold eyes. "Mrs. Hudson," the man said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Mr. Carver asked me to deliver a message. He's prepared to offer $3,500 for the property now. Final offer, but it expires in 3 days." "The answer is no," Graceland said firmly. "You sure about that? Lot can happen to a woman out here alone. Land can be dangerous. Accidents happen." Ryan stepped forward, his body language shifting from relaxed to dangerous. "Is that a threat?" "Just an observation." The writer smiled without warmth. 3 days, Mrs. Hudson. After that, Mr. Carver's interest in purchasing decreases significantly. His interest in other methods increases. He rode away before either of them could respond. Graceland felt cold despite the warm evening. "He threatened me," she said quietly. "Yes, he did." Ryan's voice was tight with controlled anger. "We need to report this to the sheriff." "And say what? He implied danger without actually threatening anything specific. It's my word against his." "Then we make sure you're not alone out here. I'll stay." "You can't stay with me. It would be completely improper."
More improper than you being attacked or run off your own land? They stared at each other, both frustrated by the impossible situation. Finally, Ryan exhaled slowly. "We'll figure something out, but Graceland, please promise me you won't come out here alone until this is resolved." "I'm not going to hide." "I'm not asking you to hide. I'm asking you to be smart about your safety." She wanted to argue, but the fear still lingering from the rider's veiled threats undermined her defiance. "Fine. I won't come out here alone. Satisfied?" "Not remotely, but it's a start." They drove back to town in tense silence, both acutely aware that the stakes had just risen significantly. Carver wasn't just trying to buy her land anymore. He was actively working to intimidate her into selling. That night, Graceland lay awake in her boarding house room, listening to the sounds of Cedar Springs settling into sleep. She thought about the fence they'd built, about Carver's threats, about the complicated tangle of feelings developing between her and Ryan. 3 days. She had 3 days before Carver's offer expired, and whatever he had planned went into motion. She fell asleep trying to decide if fear or determination would win. Determination won, though barely. Graceland woke the next morning with a plan forming in her mind. If Carver wanted to play intimidation games, she needed allies. Real ones, beyond Ryan. She needed the town to know what was happening, needed witnesses to Carver's threats, needed to make herself harder to push around. She found Sheriff McKenna in his office on 2nd Street, a gray-haired man with tired eyes and a desk piled with paperwork. He listened to her account of the previous day's encounter with polite disinterest. "Ma'am, I understand your concern, but the man didn't actually threaten you," he said when she finished. "Saying accidents happen isn't a crime. He implied that harm would come to me if I didn't sell." Implied isn't the same as stated. Unless he makes a direct threat or takes action against you, my hands are tied. McKenna leaned back in his chair. Off the record, Douglas Carver is a powerful man in this territory. He has friends in high places, deep pockets, and lawyers who know how to make trouble disappear. Unless you have ironclad evidence of wrongdoing, going after him is a fool's errand. So I'm just supposed to wait until something actually happens to me? I'm saying be careful, Mrs. Hudson. Lock your doors. Don't go places alone. And maybe consider whether keeping that land is worth the fight Carver's prepared to wage. Graceland left the sheriff's office feeling more alone than ever. The law wouldn't help her. The town's authority figured she should just give up and sell. She was on her own, except for a partner she was still learning to trust, and a dead mother whose final words had been about happiness. She was walking back toward the boarding house when she heard her name called. Turning, she saw Mrs. Patterson hurrying across the street, her face flushed with exertion. "Mrs. Hudson, I'm glad I caught you." The shopkeeper glanced around nervously. "Can we talk?"
Somewhere private? They ended up in the small garden behind the boarding house, where Mrs. Chen grew vegetables and herbs. Mrs. Patterson settled on a bench with a sigh. I heard about Carver's threats, she said without preamble. Word travels fast in a small town. Of course it does. Graceland couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. Don't be angry. Sometimes fast-traveling news is useful. Mrs. Patterson folded her hands in her lap. You're not the first person Carver's tried to intimidate, and you won't be the last. But you might be the first one with enough spine to actually stand up to him. I don't feel very brave right now. Bravery isn't about feeling fearless. It's about being terrified and doing the right thing anyway. The older woman smiled. My late husband used to say that. He was scared of everything, but he did what needed doing regardless. What are you trying to tell me, Mrs. Patterson? That you have more support than you realize. There are people in this town who are tired of watching Carver push everyone around. People who would help you if you gave them the chance. She paused. My nephew works at the telegraph office. If you need messages sent without Carver knowing, he can arrange it. And my son runs the livery stable. If you need transportation or someone watching your back, he's reliable. Graceland felt something loosen in her chest. Why would you help me? Because Carver forced my sister to sell her boarding house last year. She'd owned it 20 years, raised her children there. He wanted the lot for one of his developments, so he made her life hell until she gave in, sold for a quarter what it was worth, and Carver turned around and resold it for 10 times that amount. Mrs. Patterson's voice hardened. I don't like bullies, Mrs. Hudson, and I especially don't like watching them win. Thank you, Graceland said quietly. I don't know what I'll need yet, but knowing I have help means everything. After Mrs. Patterson left, Graceland sat in the garden and let herself feel something like hope. She wasn't completely alone. There were people who would help, who saw what Carver was and wanted him stopped. The question was how to actually stop him. Ryan arrived that afternoon with supplies for continuing the fence work. He looked surprised to find Graceland waiting with her borrowed boots already on. I thought you might want a day to rest, he said. 3 days until Carver's deadline expires, remember? I'd rather spend them building something than hiding in fear. His expression shifted to something warm and approving. Then let's build. They worked through the afternoon, making steady progress on the northern fence line. The physical labor helped quiet Graceland's anxious thoughts, gave her something concrete to focus on. Ryan worked beside her with easy competence, occasionally offering instruction, but mostly letting her find her own rhythm. During a water break, she told him about her conversation with the sheriff and Mrs. Patterson's offer of help. McKenna's useless, Ryan said bluntly. Carver probably has him in his pocket anyway. But Mrs. Patterson's support is valuable. The more people who know what's happening, the harder it is for Carver to operate in shadows. I was thinking about that. What if we made this more public? Let everyone know about the partnership, about our development plans. Make it clear I'm not some vulnerable widow who can be easily pushed around. That could work, Ryan considered. We could place a notice in the newspaper. Formal announcement of the partnership, outline of our plans for the property. It establishes legitimacy, shows we're serious. Would the newspaper print it? If Carver has influence, the editor, John Mitchell, is an ornery old bastard who hates being told what to do. If Carver has tried to pressure him, which he probably has, Mitchell would be delighted to run something that irritates him. Ryan grinned. I'll draft the notice tonight, and we can submit it tomorrow. They worked until sunset, then loaded the tools and headed back to town. Graceland's hands were raw and bleeding despite the gloves she wore, her muscles aching in places she'd forgotten existed. But the fence was taking shape, solid and real, a physical manifestation of her refusal to surrender. As they approached Cedar Springs, Ryan suddenly tensed. What's wrong? Graceland asked. Someone's been watching us. Don't turn around, but there's a rider on that ridge to the east. He's been there for the last 10 minutes. Graceland forced herself not to look. One of Carver's men? Probably. Watching to see what we're doing when we're vulnerable. Ryan's jaw tightened. I don't like this. Neither do I, but what can we do about it? Short term? Nothing. Long term? He glanced at her. We make you harder to intimidate, starting with not being alone. They arrived at the boarding house to find Mrs. Chen waiting with news. A man had come by earlier asking questions about Graceland, where she came from, how long she was staying, did she have family or connections in Cedar Springs. I told him nothing useful, Mrs. Chen said firmly, but he was persistent, offered me money for information. Did you recognize him? Ryan asked. No, but he had expensive clothes and the kind of arrogance that comes from always getting his way, not one of Carver's usual thugs. Carver himself, then. Ryan's expression darkened. He's escalating. That night, Graceland lay awake listening to every creak and groan of the boarding house settling. Fear was a cold presence in her chest, but beneath it ran something hotter, anger. She was tired of being afraid, tired of men like Carver thinking they could take whatever they wanted, tired of feeling powerless. Her mother had held on to that land for 30 years. Graceland could hold on to it for 3 more days. The next morning brought another complication. Graceland went to the bank to make a deposit from their partnership account and found her access denied. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hudson," the clerk said, looking genuinely uncomfortable, "but there's been a hold placed on your accounts pending review of certain irregularities." "What irregularities?" "Those accounts were properly established with documentation. I don't have details. You'll need to speak with Mr. Hartwell, the bank president, but he's not available until tomorrow." Graceland felt cold certainty settle over her. "This is Carver's doing, isn't it?" The clerk wouldn't meet her eyes. "I really can't say, ma'am." She found Ryan at the newspaper office, where he was indeed working with editor Mitchell on the partnership announcement. Mitchell was exactly as described, an elderly man with wild white hair and a permanent scowl. "Mrs. Hudson," he boomed when she entered. "Excellent timing. I want to interview you for a feature story. Widow stands up to land baron. It'll sell papers like hotcakes. Mr. Mitchell, I appreciate the support, but call me John, and it's not just support, it's good journalism. Carver's been running roughshod over this territory for years, and someone finally standing up to him is news." He pulled out a notebook. "Now, tell me about this partnership with Fitzpatrick here. Unusual arrangement, wouldn't you say?" Graceland glanced at Ryan, who shrugged. "Might as well. Publicity could protect you." So she told the story, or a carefully edited version of it. Met on the stagecoach, discovered mutual interests in land development, formed a legal partnership to develop the Morrison Creek property. She left out the panic attack, the growing feelings, the complicated tangle of trust and fear that characterized their relationship. Mitchell scribbled notes furiously. "And Carver's been pressuring you to sell?" "He's made his interest clear. I've declined his offers." "What about the threats? I heard one of his men implied you'd have accidents if you didn't sell." "Where did you hear that?" "Small town, Mrs. Hudson. Word travels." Mitchell grinned. "Plus, I pay my sources well, so is it true?" Ryan started to intervene, but Graceland stopped him. "Yes, it's true. One of Carver's men suggested that my refusal to sell might lead to unfortunate consequences." "That's on the record?" "It is." Mitchell's grin widened. "Excellent. This is going to be a hell of a story." After they left the newspaper office, Ryan pulled Graceland aside. That was risky. Publicly accusing Carver of threats could make him even more aggressive. Or it could make him back off. Hard to arrange accidents when everyone's watching. She told him about the bank account freeze. "He's already escalating. We need to meet that escalation with our own." "Agreed, but we need to be smart about it." Ryan thought for a moment. "I have some contacts in Denver, people who owe me favors. Let me send some telegrams, see what kind of pressure we can bring to bear on Carver from other directions." "What kind of pressure?" "The financial kind. Carver's investors won't appreciate knowing he's using illegal tactics to acquire land. Bad for business, potential legal liability. If his backers start asking uncomfortable questions, he might decide you're more trouble than you're worth." It was clever, using Carver's own methods against him. "Do it." They spent the rest of the day working on multiple fronts. Ryan sent telegrams to his contacts while Graceland met with Brennan to discuss legal options for the bank account freeze. The lawyer was furious. "This is blatant intimidation," he said, reviewing the bank's notice. "Hartwell knows damn well there are no irregularities. Carver must have significant leverage over him. Can we fight it? We can try. But bank presidents have broad authority to freeze accounts they deem suspicious. We'd need proof of malicious intent, which is hard to obtain. Brennan drummed his fingers on his desk. However, we could transfer your funds to a different bank. First Bank of Denver, perhaps, out of Carver's immediate sphere of influence. How long would that take? If we move quickly, 3 days. 3 days. The same deadline Carver had given her. The timing was almost funny. Do it, Graceland said. That evening, she and Ryan met at the boarding house to review their position. Mrs. Chen served dinner and tactfully left them alone in the dining room. The newspaper story runs tomorrow, Ryan said, consulting his notes. Your funds will transfer to Denver by Friday. I've sent telegrams to 3 of Carver's major investors expressing concern about his acquisition methods, and we've completed 2/3 of the perimeter fencing. Meanwhile, Carver has frozen my bank accounts, is having me followed, and has a deadline expiring in 2 days. Graceland pushed food around her plate. We're fighting a defensive battle. All we're doing is reacting to his moves. What would you suggest instead? I don't know, something unexpected. Something that shifts the balance of power. She looked up at Ryan. What does Carver want most? Besides my land, I mean. Reputation, respect, the image of being an unstoppable force in frontier development. Ryan considered. He's built his entire business on the perception that he always gets what he wants. Every time someone stands up to him and wins, it damages that reputation. So we don't just refuse to sell. We make his failure public. Make him an example of what happens when bullies meet people with spine. That's dangerous. You'd be making an enemy for life. I think I already have. Graceland met his eyes. I'm done being afraid, Ryan. I'm done reacting. I want to take the fight to him. Something shifted in Ryan's expression, surprise, giving way to admiration. All right, then let's plan an offensive. They talked late into the night, developing a strategy. The newspaper story would be the opening salvo, establishing public awareness. Brennan would file a formal complaint with the territorial government about Carver's intimidation tactics. Ryan's contacts would pressure Carver's investors, and Graceland herself would make a very public appearance at the town council meeting scheduled for Friday night. The council's discussing new commercial development regulations, Ryan explained. Carver always attends. He likes to influence any decisions that might affect his business interests. If you stand up during public comment and tell your story in front of the entire town leadership, it creates a record, makes it much harder for him to operate in shadows. He'll be furious, absolutely livid, which is why I'll be there with you, and we'll make sure Brennan and the sheriff are present too, along with as many sympathetic witnesses as we can gather. It was a plan. Not a perfect one, but better than cowering and hoping Carver would eventually give up. Graceland felt something like fierce joy building in her chest, the satisfaction of finally fighting back. The newspaper came out Wednesday morning, and by noon, everyone in Cedar Springs had read it. Mitchell hadn't held back. The front page featured a bold headline, Eastern Widow Defies Land Baron's Intimidation, with a full article detailing Graceland's partnership with Ryan, their development plans, and Carver's pressure tactics. The response was immediate and divided. Some townspeople approached Graceland with support and encouragement. Others gave her wide berth, clearly not wanting to be associated with someone who'd made an enemy of Douglas Carver. The bank president, Hartwell, sent a tersely worded message that her account review had been expedited and would be resolved shortly, a clear indication that public pressure was working. But the most significant response came from Carver himself. Graceland was walking back from the mercantile that afternoon when a carriage pulled alongside her. The door opened, and Douglas Carver himself leaned out. Mrs. Hudson, a word, if you please. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, but running would show weakness. She approached the carriage cautiously. Mr. Carver. That was quite a story in this morning's paper. Inflammatory, full of implications and insinuations. His smile was cold. Some might call it libelous. Truth isn't libel. Truth is a matter of perspective. You see intimidation. I see a businessman making legitimate offers for property. He leaned forward slightly. You're making a mistake, Mrs. Hudson. Fighting me will only end one way, with you broken and penniless. I always win. Always. There's a first time for everything. Is there? He studied her with something like curiosity. What makes you think you can succeed where so many others have failed? You have no money, I've seen to that. No powerful friends, No experience managing land. You're a widow playing at being a landowner, and it's only a matter of time before reality catches up to your delusions. The words were designed to wound, and they did. But Graceland had spent 2 years surviving poverty and loss. She'd learned that the truth of what others thought mattered far less than what she believed about herself. "You're wrong about one thing," she said quietly. "I do have powerful friends. I have this town watching what you do. I have a legal partnership with a man who knows your business better than you'd like. And I have something you'll never understand, nothing left to lose. That makes me far more dangerous than you realize." Carver's expression hardened. "My final offer expires Friday at noon. After that, I withdraw all offers and pursue other methods of acquisition. I strongly suggest you reconsider your position." "I've considered it thoroughly. The answer is no. It will always be no." He stared at her for a long moment, then rapped on the carriage roof. The driver pulled away, leaving Graceland standing in the street with her heart racing and her hand shaking. She'd just declared open war on the most powerful man in the territory. Ryan found her an hour later, still sitting in Mrs. Chen's garden trying to process what she'd done. He sat beside her without speaking, just a steady presence in the chaos. "I spoke to Carver," she finally said. "He cornered me on the street." "What did he say?" She repeated the conversation. Ryan's expression grew increasingly grim. "Friday at noon. That's when the town council meeting starts." He ran a hand through his hair. "He's going to make a move then. Something public, designed to humiliate you and demonstrate his power. Let him try. Graceland, I admire your courage, but we need to be realistic. Carver has resources we can't match. If he decides to truly come after you, then I'll deal with it. With your help, if you're still willing to stand with me." Ryan turned to face her fully. "I told you on the stagecoach that I'd help if you needed it. That hasn't changed. But I need you to understand what you're risking. This isn't just about land anymore. You're challenging a man who sees defiance as a personal insult. He won't stop until either he wins or you're destroyed." "I know." Graceland met his eyes. "But I'm not backing down. My mother held this land for 30 years because it meant something. It's not just property, it's proof that we existed, that we mattered. I won't give that up because some bully thinks women can't hold what's theirs. Then we make sure you're protected. Starting tonight, I'm staying here at the boarding house. Mrs. Chen has a spare room. I'm not leaving you vulnerable." "Ryan, that's not necessary." "It is. Carver knows his deadline is expiring. These next 2 days are when he's most likely to try something desperate. Please, let me do this." The concern in his voice, the intensity in his eyes, it was more than professional partnership. They both knew it. And standing in the garden with sunset painting the sky orange and gold, Graceland made a decision. "All right, but Ryan, after this is over, after we know whether I keep the land or lose everything, we need to talk about what's happening between us." "I know." His voice was soft. "I've been trying not to think about it, to keep everything professional and proper. But Graceland, I can't keep pretending I don't feel... Don't." She held up a hand. "Not yet. Not while everything is so complicated and uncertain. When this is settled, one way or another, then we'll talk, but not before." He nodded, though she could see the frustration in the set of his shoulders. "All right. When it's settled." That night, Graceland lay awake knowing Ryan was just down the hall. The knowledge was both comforting and disturbing. She'd sworn after Thomas died that she would never again make herself vulnerable to that kind of loss. Never depend on anyone. Never let her happiness rest in another person's hands. But Ryan was making that resolution increasingly difficult to maintain. Thursday passed in a blur of preparation. Brennan filed official complaints with the territorial government about Carver's intimidation tactics. Ryan's contacts in Denver sent word that several of Carver's investors were indeed asking uncomfortable questions about his methods. And Graceland wrote and rewrote the statement she would deliver at the town council meeting, trying to find words that would convey the truth without sounding desperate or hysterical. That evening, she practiced her speech in the boarding house parlor while Ryan listened. "I stand before you as a property owner being systematically harassed by a man who believes power and money exempt him from decent behavior," she read. "Douglas Carver has threatened me, frozen my bank accounts, and made clear that my refusal to sell will result in consequences. I'm not asking for special treatment or protection. I'm simply asking that the law be applied equally, regardless of how much money or influence the perpetrator possesses. It's good, Ryan said when she finished. Direct, clear, impossible to dismiss as emotional rambling. You sound like someone demanding justice, not begging for help. Will it work? Honestly, I don't know. But it'll make it much harder for Carver to operate unchecked, and it'll show everyone in this town that you're not backing down. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Finally, Ryan spoke. Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know this partnership, helping you keep your land, it's been the most meaningful work I've done in years. Win or lose, I don't regret it. Even though it cost you your relationship with Carver, your reputation with other investors, especially because of that. Working for men like Carver was making me into someone I didn't like. You gave me a reason to remember who I actually want to be. The words hung in the air, laden with everything they weren't saying. Graceland wanted to reach for his hand, wanted to close the distance between them and see where it led. But she'd set her own boundary, nothing until this was settled, and she needed to honor it. Thank you, she said instead, for everything, for helping me through the storm, for buying me a pie, for making me believe I could actually do this. Whatever happens tomorrow, I'm grateful you were on that stagecoach. Ryan's smile was warm and genuine. So am I. Friday morning dawned clear and bright, mocking the tension that gripped Cedar Springs. The town council meeting was scheduled for noon in the courthouse assembly hall. By 11, people were already gathering, drawn by the promise of drama. Graceland dressed carefully in her best remaining dress, the dark green that had survived the stagecoach journey with only mud stains. Mrs. Chen helped her pin up her hair properly, transforming her from exhausted widow to someone who looked capable of taking on a land baron. You look strong, Mrs. Chen said, stepping back to examine her work. That's good. Let them see strength. Ryan was waiting downstairs in a dark suit that made him look professional and formidable. He offered his arm formally. Ready? No, but I'm going anyway. They walked to the courthouse together, and Graceland was surprised to see familiar faces gathering in support. Mrs. Patterson was there with her nephew and son. The shopkeeper, James Chen, Mrs. Chen's husband, stood near the door. Even old Mrs. Brennan from the stagecoach had come, supported by her son, the lawyer. You've got more friends than you knew, Ryan murmured as they entered the assembly hall. The room was packed. The town council sat at a raised table at the front, 5 men of varying ages and dispositions. And in the front row, looking entirely too confident, sat Douglas Carver. He caught Graceland's eye and smiled, a predator's smile, all teeth and no warmth. She lifted her chin and walked past him to seats in the middle section, refusing to be intimidated. The meeting started with routine business, approving minutes, discussing budget allocations, debating a new ordinance about livestock and town limits. Graceland barely heard any of it. Her speech was folded in her pocket, her heart hammering against her ribs. Finally, the council president, a distinguished man named Wallace, called for public comments. Any citizen wishing to address the council may approach the podium, he announced. Graceland stood. The room went silent. Every eye tracked her movement as she walked to the front and faced the council. From the corner of her vision, she could see Carver leaning forward, interested despite himself. Mr. President, council members, thank you for allowing me to speak. Her voice was steady, thank goodness. My name is Graceland Hudson. 3 weeks ago, I inherited 20 acres of land at Morrison Creek. Since then, I have been subjected to systematic harassment by a man who wants that land and is willing to use any method, legal or otherwise, to obtain it. She proceeded to lay out everything, Carver's initial offers, the threats from his employees, the frozen bank accounts, his attempt to gather personal information from Mrs. Chen. She kept her tone factual, her recitation calm, but she didn't soften the truth. I'm not here to ask for special protection, she concluded. I'm here to put on public record that Douglas Carver is using intimidation and illegal financial manipulation to force me to sell property I have every right to own. I'm asking that this council, the elected representatives of Cedar Springs, acknowledge that such behavior is unacceptable, regardless of who perpetrates it. The silence when she finished was absolute. Then Carver rose smoothly to his feet. Mr. President, may I respond to these accusations? Wallace looked uncomfortable, but nodded. "You have the floor, Mr. Carver." Carver approached the podium with the confidence of a man who'd never lost an argument. "Mrs. Hudson's distress is understandable. She's a widow, recently bereaved of her mother, trying to manage property she doesn't understand. But her characterization of my business dealings is both inaccurate and defamatory." He proceeded to present his version: legitimate business offers never accepted. Concern for a woman trying to manage land beyond her capabilities. No threats, no harassment, merely persistent interest in a valuable property. As for the bank account situation, I have no control over First Bank's internal review processes. If Mrs. Hudson's accounts were frozen, perhaps she should examine whether her own financial irregularities prompted that action rather than blaming me for the bank's due diligence. It was smoothly done, painting Graceland as an emotional woman overreacting to standard business practices. She felt rage building in her chest, but forced herself to remain calm. Then Ryan stood. "Mr. President, may I also address the council?" Wallace looked even more uncomfortable. "Mr. Fitzpatrick, are you here in a professional capacity?" "I'm here as Mrs. Hudson's business partner and as someone who has worked with Douglas Carver extensively. I can speak to his standard operating procedures." "This is highly irregular," Carver began. "So is freezing a widow's bank accounts," Ryan interrupted, his voice cutting. "Mr. President, I have documents proving that Mr. Carver requested First Bank freeze Mrs. Hudson's accounts as a personal favor. I also have written testimony from 3 of his employees detailing the threats they were instructed to deliver. Would the council like to review these materials?" The assembly hall erupted. Carver's face went red, then white. Wallace banged his gavel for order. "This is an outrage," Carver shouted. "Those documents are privileged business communications. They're evidence of criminal intimidation," Ryan shot back, "and they're now part of public record. Perhaps you'd like to explain to your investors why you need to use illegal tactics to acquire land." The meeting dissolved into chaos. The council called for a recess to review Ryan's evidence. Carver stormed toward the exit, but found his path blocked by Sheriff McKenna, who'd apparently developed a sudden interest in upholding the law. In the confusion, Ryan made his way to Graceland's side. "You had evidence the whole time," she said quietly. "I had suspicions and spent the last 3 days gathering proof. I wanted to wait until the most damaging moment to use it." He smiled grimly. "Seems I timed it well." The council reconvened 30 minutes later with grim expressions. Wallace cleared his throat. After reviewing the materials presented by Mr. Fitzpatrick, this council finds credible evidence of harassment and financial manipulation directed at Mrs. Hudson. We are referring these matters to the territorial attorney for investigation. Furthermore, we are issuing a formal censure of Douglas Carver's business practices and recommending that all town dealings with his enterprises be suspended pending resolution of these allegations. It wasn't everything, but it was something, more than Graceland had dared hope for. The assembly hall buzzed with reaction, some approving, some shocked, some clearly calculating how this power shift would affect their own interests. Carver stood rigid, his face a mask of fury. "This isn't over," he said, his voice carrying despite the noise. He was looking directly at Graceland. "You'll regret this." "Is that another threat, Mr. Carver?" Sheriff McKenna asked mildly. "Because I'm standing right here taking notes." And Carver turned and left without another word. But Graceland saw something in his eyes that chilled her. Not defeat, but determination. Ryan was right. This wasn't over. It was barely beginning. But as townspeople approached to offer congratulations and support, as Mrs. Patterson squeezed her hand and old Mrs. Brennan nodded approval, Graceland felt something she hadn't felt in years. Victory. Temporary, incomplete, possibly Pyrrhic, but victory nonetheless. She'd stood up to a bully and walked away standing. Whatever came next, she'd proven she could fight, and that knowledge was worth more than all of Carver's money and intimidation combined. The victory at the town council meeting bought them exactly 3 days of peace. On Monday morning, Graceland woke to the smell of smoke. She threw open her window and saw black plumes rising from the direction of Morrison Creek. Her heart stopped. She was down the stairs and out the door before her mind fully caught up to what she was seeing. Ryan met her in the street, already hitching horses to the wagon with grim efficiency. "The fence," he said tersely.
Someone set fire to it. They drove at reckless speed, arriving to find the entire western fence line engulfed in flames. The dry prairie grass had caught, and fire was spreading toward the creek with terrifying speed. If it reached the cottonwoods, the timber stand would be next. "We need help," Graceland said, already running toward the creek. "We can't fight this alone." But help was already coming. Mrs. Patterson's son arrived with men from the livery stable. James Chen brought workers from the mercantile. Even Sheriff McKenna appeared with deputies and equipment. By mid-morning, half the town was beating back flames and digging fire breaks. Ryan worked like a man possessed, his face black with soot, shirt soaked with sweat and creek water. Graceland labored beside him, her hands blistering around the shovel handle, lungs burning from smoke. They fought the fire for 6 hours before finally bringing it under control. The damage was extensive. The entire western fence line was destroyed. 2 acres of prime grassland were scorched black. The fire had stopped mere feet from the cottonwood grove, close enough that several trees showed heat damage on their bark. Standing in the smoking ruins of their work, Graceland felt something inside her crack. "He did this," she said quietly. "Carver did this." "Probably." Ryan's voice was rough from smoke. "But we'll never prove it. No witnesses, no evidence linking him directly, just convenient timing. So he gets away with it. Unless we give him exactly what he wants, make you so discouraged you sell and leave." Graceland looked at the destruction, at the weeks of work reduced to ash, at the hundreds of dollars in materials and labor now worthless. Every practical instinct screamed at her to quit, to take whatever money she could get and run before Carver destroyed everything. But Thomas had taught her something in their 3 years together, something she'd forgotten in the 2 years since his death. Sometimes the things worth having were the things you had to fight for, even when the fight seemed impossible. "No," she said. "We rebuild." Ryan turned to look at her, surprise and something like awe in his eyes. "Graceland, the cost?" "I don't care about the cost. He wants me broken. I'll show him what Hudson women are made of." She met his gaze directly. "We rebuild, starting today, and we don't stop until this land is exactly what we planned it to be." But a slow smile spread across Ryan's soot-stained face. "Then we'd better order more materials." The town's response to the fire was overwhelming. Mrs. Patterson organized a donation drive for supplies. The lumber mill offered materials at cost. Men volunteered labor for the reconstruction. Even the territorial attorney's office sent word that they were investigating the fire as suspected arson and were building a case against Carver for the harassment documented at the council meeting. But the most surprising support came from an unexpected source. 3 days after the fire, a well-dressed stranger appeared at the boarding house asking for Graceland. He introduced himself as Marcus Webb, representative for Eastern Investment Group, one of Carver's major backers. "Mrs. Hudson, I've been reviewing reports of Mr. Carver's activities in this territory," Webb said once they were settled in the parlor with Ryan present. "Your situation came to our attention through certain telegrams we received. I wanted to speak with you directly." "Why?" Graceland asked, immediately suspicious. "Because Eastern Investment Group does not condone illegal business practices. Intimidation, arson, financial manipulation, these methods are not only morally reprehensible, but also legally risky for our investors. If Mr. Carver has indeed engaged in such tactics, it violates the terms of his contract with us." Ryan leaned forward. "What are you proposing, Mr. Webb?" "We're terminating our relationship with Douglas Carver. All funding for his frontier acquisitions will cease immediately. Furthermore, we're prepared to offer Mrs. Hudson compensation for the damages to her property as a gesture of good faith." He produced an envelope. $5,000, no strings attached. Simply our acknowledgement that one of our contractors behaved abominably, and we wish to make amends. Graceland stared at the envelope. $5,000. More than enough to rebuild everything Carver had destroyed and properly develop the land. It felt too good to be true. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked. Webb's expression turned rueful. "Honestly? Because you made us look foolish. A widow standing up to our contractor and exposing his methods made national news. Eastern Investment Group's reputation is taking a beating in the financial press. This is damage control. But that doesn't make the money less real
or the offer less genuine. What happens to Carver? Without our backing, his entire frontier operation collapses. He's overextended, counting on our capital to maintain his land holdings. Within 6 months, he'll be forced to liquidate most of his properties just to stay solvent. Webb allowed himself a small smile. You've effectively destroyed him, Mrs. Hudson. This is just the final nail in the coffin. After Webb left, Graceland sat with the envelope in her hands, trying to process what had just happened. She'd set out simply to keep her mother's land. Instead, she'd brought down one of the territory's most powerful men. You're terrifyingly effective when you're angry, Ryan observed. I wasn't trying to destroy him. I just wanted him to leave me alone. Sometimes those are the same thing. He paused. Are you going to accept the money? Would it be wrong to? Taking compensation from the company that funded the man who tried to run me off my own land? I think it would be smart business. You earned that money by refusing to back down. Take it, rebuild, make this land into everything you planned. Graceland looked at him. This man who'd appeared in her life at exactly the right moment, who'd stood beside her through panic attacks and fires and public confrontations, who'd believed in her when she barely believed in herself. We rebuild together, she said. Partners, just like we agreed. The reconstruction took 6 weeks of brutal work. They rebuilt the fence stronger than before, using better materials and more strategic placement. They purchased 20 head of cattle, good breeding stock that would form the foundation of a herd. They hired men to selectively harvest timber from the north section, generating immediate income. And they cut the first hay harvest from the meadow, selling it to neighboring ranches at premium prices. By late summer, Morrison Creek was transformed, fenced, stocked, productive. The partnership was generating steady income, and the land's value had tripled. Graceland kept meticulous records of every transaction, every expense, every profit. She was learning the business from the ground up, and she was good at it. She was also, she realized one morning while reviewing accounts, happy. Actually, genuinely happy for the first time since Thomas died. The revelation startled her. Happiness had seemed like something that happened to other people, something she'd lost the right to feel. But here it was, sneaking up on her in quiet moments, when she stood on her land watching cattle graze, when she balanced accounts and saw steady profit, when Ryan appeared at sunrise ready for another day's work, especially when Ryan appeared. They'd maintained careful professional distance throughout the reconstruction, both honoring Graceland's boundary about waiting until things were settled. But now things were settled. Carver had left Cedar Springs entirely, his business empire in ruins. The partnership was thriving. The land was secure, which meant Graceland could no longer avoid the conversation they'd been postponing. She found Ryan one evening in late August, sitting by the creek on their land, watching the sun set behind the cottonwoods. He looked up as she approached, and something in his expression suggested he'd been expecting her. "We need to talk," she said, settling on the grass beside him. "I know." He picked up a stone and skipped it across the water. "I've been waiting. About what's happening between us. Is something happening between us?" His tone was carefully neutral, but she could hear the tension beneath it. Graceland took a breath. This was harder than standing up to Carver, harder than anything she'd done in years. "You know there is. We've both been pretending otherwise, but we're not very good at pretending." "No, we're not." He turned to face her fully. "So what do we do about it?" "I don't know. I swore after Thomas died that I'd never make myself that vulnerable again. Never depend on someone else for my happiness or security. Never risk that kind of loss. I understand that, and I'm not asking you to depend on me. You've proven you can stand on your own." He paused. "But Graceland, standing alone and being alone aren't the same thing. What if I can't do this? What if I try and fail and ruin everything we've built? Then we deal with it, together." Ryan reached for her hand, his touch tentative. "I'm not Thomas. I'm not going to die in a fence accident or leave you with debts and broken dreams. I'm just a man who got on a stagecoach expecting a routine trip and found something he didn't know he'd been looking for." "What's that?" "Someone who challenges me, who makes me want to be better than I am, who reminds me that land and business and profit matter less than the people you build them with." His grip on her hand tightened. "Someone I could love, if you'd let me try." The word love hung in the air between them. terrifying and wonderful. Graceland felt tears prickling her eyes. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "So am I. But I've learned something from you. Being afraid isn't a good reason not to do something worth doing." She laughed, a wet sound caught between crying and joy. "You're using my own words against me." "Is it working?" Graceland looked at their joined hands, then at his face, those riverstone eyes watching her with hope and patience and something deeper. She thought about the stagecoach journey that had started all of this. The storm, the panic attack, his steady presence, the pie he'd bought her, the funeral he'd attended, the partnership he'd offered, the fire he'd helped her fight. Every moment of kindness and support and belief when she'd had nothing to offer in return. She thought about her mother's last words. "Be happy." "Yes," she said quietly. "It's working." Ryan's smile was like sunrise, slow, warm, transforming everything. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "So what now?" he asked. "Now we stop pretending this is just a business partnership. We see where it goes. We take it slowly because I need slowly, and we promise to be honest with each other, even when honesty is hard." "I can do that." They sat by the creek until full dark, talking about everything and nothing, their hopes for the land, their fears about the future, the way they'd both changed since that muddy road outside Millbrook. It felt natural in a way Graceland hadn't expected, like conversations they'd been having for years instead of months. When Ryan finally walked her back to the boarding house, he paused at the door. "Can I court you properly?" he asked. "Flowers, Sunday dinners, the whole traditional ritual?" "You want to court me? After everything we've already been through?" "Especially after everything we've been through. You deserve to be courted properly, not just fall into something because it's convenient or we're already partners. I want to do this right." Graceland felt warmth spreading through her chest. "Then yes, you can court me properly." He kissed her hand again, formal and sweet. "Good night, Graceland." "Good night, Ryan." She watched him walk away down the dark street, and for the first time in years, the future looked like something to anticipate rather than endure. The courtship was charmingly old-fashioned. Ryan brought flowers every Sunday, wildflowers from the property at first, then increasingly elaborate bouquets from the town florist. They had dinner with Mrs. Chen and her husband, proper and chaperoned. They took walks through Cedar Springs, enduring the knowing smiles of townspeople who'd watched their partnership develop into something more. And they worked the land together, finding that physical labor and business discussions blended seamlessly with courtship. There was something intimate about building fence side by side, about reviewing accounts together, about making plans for spring planting while sitting under the cottonwoods. 3 months after that evening by the creek, Ryan asked Graceland to come to the property on a Sunday afternoon. She found him waiting by the largest cottonwood, looking nervous in a way she'd never seen him. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Nothing's wrong. Everything's actually very right, which is what makes this terrifying." He took her hands. "Graceland, I know we agreed to take this slowly, and we have been. But there's something I need to ask you, and I don't think waiting longer will make it any less scary or any more certain." Her heart started racing. "Ryan, let me say this before I lose my nerve." He took a deep breath. "I love you. I think I started loving you somewhere between the muddy road and the panic attack on the stagecoach, but I didn't recognize it then. I've spent the last 6 months falling deeper, and I don't want to stop. I don't want to go back to my life before you. I don't want to imagine a future without you in it." He released one of her hands and pulled a small box from his pocket. "Marry me. Be my partner in everything, not just business. Let me spend the rest of my life proving that you can trust me with your heart, the way you've trusted me with your land." Graceland stared at the box, her mind racing. Every fear she'd carried since Thomas died rose up to protest. Loss, vulnerability, dependence, the terrifying possibility of loving someone and having them taken away. But beneath the fear ran something stronger. Hope, trust, the certainty that some risks were worth taking. "Yes," she said, the word barely a whisper. Ryan's expression transformed. "Yes? Yes. I'll marry you, I love you, and I'm terrified, and I'm saying yes anyway." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond. Nothing ostentatious, nothing that screamed wealth or possession. It was perfect. Ryan slid it onto her finger with shaking hands, then pulled her close and kissed her properly for the first time. It was sweet and tentative and full of promise, everything their relationship had been from the beginning. When they finally broke apart, Graceland was crying. "Happy tears?" Ryan asked, brushing them away gently. "Happy tears," she confirmed. "I didn't think I'd ever feel this again. Happiness. Hope. The sense that the future could be good. It will be. We'll make it good. Together." They told Mrs. Chen that evening, and the older woman's face lit with genuine joy. "I knew from the moment you both arrived," she said, pouring celebratory tea. "Two broken people finding each other. It's a good story, the best kind." "We're not broken anymore," Graceland said. "No, you fixed each other. That's even better." The wedding was planned for October, giving them time to prepare properly. Graceland commissioned a dress from the best seamstress in Cedar Springs, cream silk with lace at the collar, elegant without being ostentatious. Ryan arranged for a reception at the new community hall, insisting that everyone who'd supported them deserved to celebrate. But 2 weeks before the wedding, an unexpected guest arrived in Cedar Springs. Graceland was working in the mercantile office. She'd taken on bookkeeping for several local businesses to supplement the ranch income, when Mrs. Patterson appeared at the door looking flustered. "Mrs. Hudson, there's a man here asking for you. Says his name is Douglas Carver." Everything in Graceland went cold. "Carver's here? Waiting outside. He looks different, defeated almost." Graceland found him standing by his horse, and Mrs. Patterson was right. The Douglas Carver who'd terrorized her 6 months ago had been polished, confident, radiating power. This man looked hollow. His expensive suit hung loose on a frame that had lost weight. His face was drawn, aged beyond his years. "Mrs. Hudson," he said quietly, "thank you for seeing me." "What do you want, Mr. Carver?" "To apologize." The words seemed to cost him. For everything. The threats, the fire, the harassment. "I was wrong. About you, about my methods, about what matters." Graceland studied him, looking for deception or manipulation, but all she saw was exhaustion and genuine regret. "Why are you really here?" "Because I lost everything, and it turns out you were right. The reputation, the power, the empire I built, it was all built on sand. When your story went public, when my investors pulled out, everything collapsed. I'm bankrupt, Mrs. Hudson, completely ruined." He managed a bitter smile. "Turns out forcing people to sell their land isn't a sustainable business model. I'm sorry for your troubles, but I'm not sure why you're telling me this. Because you deserve to know that you won, completely and utterly. And because I wanted to apologize to your face before I leave this territory for good." He pulled an envelope from his pocket. "This is the deed to 40 acres adjacent to your property. It's all I have left. Consider it payment for the damages I caused and an apology for being the kind of man who thought power excused cruelty." He held out the envelope. Graceland didn't take it. "I don't want your land, Mr. Carver." "Then sell it, donate it, burn the deed for all I care. But I'm not leaving until you take it. It's the only restitution I can offer." Graceland thought about refusing on principle. But she thought too about her mother's pragmatism, about the value of 40 acres with water access, about the future she and Ryan were building. "All right, I'll take it. But Mr. Carver, I hope you use this loss to become a better man. Not because you owe me anything, but because the alternative is dying bitter and alone." Something shifted in his expression, surprise maybe, or recognition. "You're remarkably generous to someone who tried to destroy you." "I'm not generous, I'm just tired of carrying anger around. It's exhausting." After Carver left, Graceland sat with the deed in her hands, marveling at the strange twists of fate. She'd started this journey with nothing but a dying mother and $5 in her pocket. Now she owned 60 acres of prime land, had a thriving business partnership, and was 2 weeks away from marrying a man she loved. It felt impossible. It felt earned. When she told Ryan about Carver's visit that evening, he laughed in disbelief. 60 acres! We could run a proper herd with that much land. Maybe even start breeding horses. His eyes were bright with possibility. Graceland, do you realize what this means? We're not just surviving anymore. We're building something that will last. I know. She leaned against him, comfortable in a way that still surprised her. My mother would have liked this. All of it. The land, the business, you. You think so? She told me to be happy. I think this is what she meant. The wedding took place on a perfect October afternoon, with cottonwood leaves turning gold and the air crisp with autumn promise. The ceremony was held on their land by the creek, with half of Cedar Springs in attendance. Graceland wore her cream silk dress and carried wildflowers from the property. Ryan stood waiting under the largest cottonwood, looking nervous and happy and impossibly handsome in his dark suit. Mrs. Chen stood as her attendant, Brennan as Ryan's. The minister kept the ceremony simple, focusing on partnership and trust rather than obedience and submission. When it came time for vows, Ryan spoke first. Graceland, I promise to stand beside you, not in front of or behind you. I promise to trust your strength while offering mine. I promise to build with you, laugh with you, and face whatever comes with honesty and courage. I promise to love you not because you need me, but because I choose you every day for the rest of my life. Graceland's voice shook when she responded, Ryan, I promise to trust you with my fears as well as my hopes. I promise to be your partner in all things, to build a life together that honors both our pasts and our future. I promise to love you courageously, despite being afraid, because you've shown me that the best things in life require the biggest leaps of faith. They exchanged rings, his matching hers, simple gold bands that spoke of permanence rather than flash. And when the minister pronounced them married, Ryan kissed her with such tenderness that Graceland felt tears streaming down her face. The reception was joyful chaos. Mrs. Patterson had organized food contributions from half the town. There was music, dancing, toasts that ranged from heartfelt to hilarious. Even Sheriff McKenna showed up, offering gruff congratulations and admitting he'd been wrong to dismiss Graceland's initial complaints. As the sun set and lanterns were lit, Graceland found herself standing with Ryan slightly apart from the celebration, watching their friends and neighbors enjoy themselves on land that was now theirs together. Are you happy? Ryan asked quietly. She thought about the question, about the stagecoach journey that had brought her here, about her mother's death and the land she'd inherited, about Carver's threats and the fire and the town council meeting, about every moment of fear and struggle that had led to this one. Yes, she said simply. I am completely, impossibly happy. Good, that was always the goal. They stayed at the boarding house that night. Mrs. Chen had insisted, saying the newlyweds deserved one night before returning to the hard work of running a ranch. In the small room that had been Graceland's sanctuary for months, she and Ryan began their married life with tenderness and laughter and the comfortable intimacy of two people who already knew each other's fears and strengths. The next morning, they rode out to their land together. The work of building a life was waiting, cattle to tend, accounts to manage, fences to maintain, plans to make for the coming year. But it felt different now. Not survival, but creation. Not endurance, but joy. Do you ever think about that stagecoach? Graceland asked as they surveyed their property from the ridge. If I'd taken a different coach, or if you delayed your trip, or if we'd never met. All the time. And I'm grateful for every muddy road and broken wheel that brought us together. Even the panic attack? Especially the panic attack. That's when I knew. Knew what? That you were someone worth knowing, worth helping, worth... He paused, searching for words. Worth changing my entire life for. Graceland leaned against him, comfortable and content. I never thanked you properly for that, for talking me through it, for being steady when I was falling apart. You don't need to thank me. You've given me more than I ever gave you. He kissed the top of her head. You gave me purpose. You reminded me what integrity looks like. You made me want to be the kind of man worthy of standing beside you. You always were that man. You just needed someone to see it. They stood together watching the sun climb higher, warming the autumn air. In the distance, cattle grazed peacefully. The creek sparkled in the morning light. The land they'd fought for and built together spread before them like a promise kept. 6 months ago, Graceland had boarded a stagecoach with nothing but grief and desperation. She'd been running toward a dying mother and away from a life that had become unbearable. She'd expected nothing from the journey except more loss. Instead, she'd found partnership, purpose, love, a future worth building, and the courage to build it. "Come on," Ryan said, breaking the peaceful silence. "We've got work to do." "We always have work to do." "True, but now we get to do it together." They rode down to the ranch house they'd begun building, a modest structure that would grow as their family and business grew. It wasn't finished yet, but the foundation was solid, built to last, just like everything else they'd created together. That evening, after a long day of work, they sat on the unfinished porch and watched the sun set behind the cottonwoods. Graceland's hand rested in Ryan's, their wedding rings catching the last light. "I've been thinking about what to name this place," Ryan said. "Every good ranch needs a name." "What did you have in mind?" "I thought maybe we'd call it Hope Creek Ranch, because that's what this place is. Hope made real." Graceland felt tears prickling her eyes again. Happy tears, like at the proposal, like at the wedding, like every time she fully grasped how completely her life had transformed. "Hope Creek Ranch," she repeated. "I like it. It's perfect." And it was, not because the land was perfect, or because their lives would be without struggle, or because love solved every problem, but because they'd taken broken pieces, a widow's grief, a man's disillusionment, 20 acres of empty land, and built something whole and strong and worth having. Years later, when people asked Graceland how she'd built Hope Creek Ranch into one of the most successful operations in the territory, she always told them the same thing. It started with a stagecoach, a storm, and a stranger who'd held her hand through the worst moment of her life and somehow never let go. It started with choosing courage over fear, trust over safety, hope over resignation. It started with being brave enough to say yes when everything in her wanted to run. And it ended, though it never really ended, with two people sitting on a porch they'd built together, watching the sun set on land they'd fought for, knowing that the best journeys begin with broken wheels and muddy roads, and the willingness to accept help from unexpected places. "Thank you," Graceland said quietly, "not for the first time and not for the last." Ryan squeezed her hand. "For what?" "For being on that stagecoach, for buying me a pie, for believing I could do this when I didn't believe it myself. You would have done it anyway. You're the strongest person I know." "Maybe, but I'm glad I didn't have to do it alone." "Neither am I." The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Another day ending, another day of their shared life complete, and tomorrow they'd wake and do it all again. Build, work, love, create a future worth having, together, the way the best things were always done.